What rotten luck! We're going to lose the business class tickets, Mom muttered, checking the clock while Zoe lay behind the ER doors after paramedics brought her in blue and barely moving air. Dad said staying wouldn't change anything. I didn't answer. 20 minutes later, Dr. Feld came through those doors with a chest image printout on her tablet and a tiny clear specimen cup. Who can explain why this was in her airway? My parents stopped moving. Mom's phone slipped from her hand. For the first time that afternoon, neither of them cared what time it was. Before I tell you how we got there, I hope you're doing well wherever you're listening from. Stay with me to the end, because what happened that day changed the way I understood the people I trusted most. And if stories like this mean something to you, I'd be glad to have you subscribe and stay with us. That Saturday had begun with passports, blueberry muffins, and my father's claim that he was fully prepared for France because he spoke 3 essential words of French. It was the 27th of June, 2026, one of those early summer mornings outside Boston when the sky became bright long before anyone in the neighborhood had a good reason to be awake. By 7:30, Zoe had already checked the weather in Paris twice, changed the sweatshirt tied around her waist 3 times, and asked me whether 11 was old enough to appreciate architecture properly. I told her I had no idea. She informed me that was fine because Grandpa did. The trip had been all Zoe talked about for weeks. Dad had traveled often after retiring from civil engineering, and Mom had spent decades as a luxury travel advisor. Airports, connections, and hotel details were systems she knew how to control. Paris, with their granddaughter, had become her latest project. Mom's travel competence had always been part of the background of my life. She knew which terminal entrances became congested first, which connections looked reasonable on paper but were not worth the sprint, and which hotel promises required a second question before anyone handed over a credit card. As a child, I had thought every mother carried backup plans inside her handbag. As an adult, I understood that preparation was one of the ways Patricia loved people. She anticipated trouble before anyone else noticed it. That was why I trusted her with Zoe so easily, and why the choices she made later would be so difficult for me to reconcile with the woman I thought I knew. Their evening flight was not until later, but Mom had scheduled the day as if Logan Airport might close without warning if they arrived 20 minutes behind plan. Zoe was spending the morning at their house, while I finished a few things at home, and Michael would join me later before we all went to the airport to see them off. Mom had found business class fares she considered almost a personal victory, restricted, carefully timed, still expensive enough that she had mentioned the savings to me 4 separate times. After Paris, she and Dad planned to take trains to 2 other cities before flying home. The hotels, several tours, and part of the rail travel had already been prepaid. To Zoe, none of that mattered as much as the fact that she would get a seat that turned into a bed. She had watched a video of the cabin so many times that she knew where the reading light was before she had ever seen the aircraft. When we pulled into my parents' driveway that morning, she was out of the car before I had finished gathering the document envelope from the passenger seat. Their house sat on a quiet street of maples and older colonials, the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew which garbage day belonged to which side of the road, and nobody admitted to noticing when someone replaced an original front door with something too modern. Dad was already outside. He had hearing aids in both ears and sunglasses pushed up onto his head, even though he was standing beneath the porch roof. Zoe hit him at the waist with a hug hard enough to make him rock backward. Watching them together had always been easy. Dad had never treated children like unfinished adults, who needed to wait their turn to become interesting. When Zoe was 6, he taught her how to read a paper map after she asked why anyone needed one when phones existed. When she was 8, he began giving her tiny route challenges on walks, letting her decide which way would bring them back to the car. By 10, she could tell when he deliberately took a wrong turn just to see whether she noticed. Their ongoing competition over navigation had become one of those family jokes I assumed would last until Zoe was old enough to drive and Dad was old enough to complain about the way she did it. That morning, he pointed at her backpack and announced that he hoped she had left enough room for souvenirs. Zoe informed him that Grandma had already said nobody was buying useless souvenirs. Dad glanced toward the house, where Mom was visible through the front window, moving between the dining room and kitchen. Then he lowered his voice with theatrical seriousness and said he had prepared himself for France by mastering the language. Bonjour, merci, croissant. Zoe stared at him. One of those is breakfast. Dad held her gaze for another second before conceding that breakfast was essential to international diplomacy. She laughed loud enough that Mom opened the front door and reminded both of them that she was trying to check documents. That sound, the two of them laughing on the porch, stayed with me longer than I wanted it to afterward. There are memories that become painful because they were already sad when they happened. Others become painful only after you learn what came next. At 8 that morning, there was nothing frightening in front of me. My daughter was leaving on the biggest adventure of her life, with 2 grandparents she adored. I was the mother taking too many photographs before they had even reached the airport. Inside, Mom had turned half the dining table into a departure station. 3 passports were lined up beside a clear travel wallet. The notarized permission Michael and I had signed for Zoe to travel internationally with my parents sat behind the medical contact authorization, insurance details, copies of our phone numbers, and the printed itinerary Mom insisted on carrying, even though every reservation existed on her phone. I handed her the document envelope I had brought. She checked it anyway. That was Mom. Patricia Warren trusted preparation more than luck. She remembered permission slips, packed aspirin and sewing kits before anyone asked, and treated backup chargers as a moral obligation. I had spent years reading that competence as safety, especially where Zoe was concerned. While Mom rearranged the paperwork, Zoe climbed onto a dining chair and inspected the snacks packed for the car ride to Logan. Dad had moved into the kitchen and was standing near the counter with a glass of water. Zoe looked over. "Grandpa, did you take the blue one?" Dad glanced at her, then at the small water glass in his hand. He nodded and patted the pocket of his shirt before returning his attention to the newspaper folded on the counter. I barely registered it. Mom had always organized Dad's prescriptions when they traveled. Zoe had spent enough time with them to imitate little routines, just as she knew Mom never checked luggage without photographing the bag first, and Dad always forgot to put his phone on airplane mode until someone reminded him. I thought Zoe was playing assistant because being included made her happy. Mom smiled at her and said something about having the best helper in Massachusetts. Zoe straightened slightly at the compliment. Then we moved on. There are moments I went back to later and wanted to force open, as if enough inspection might reveal the warning I should have understood. But memory is unfair when you revisit it with the ending already in your hand. At the time, an 11-year-old reminding her grandfather about a pill did not look sinister. It looked affectionate. It looked like familiarity. Dad asked me what time Michael planned to meet us. I told him a little after 4. Less than 5 minutes later, while I was helping Mom fold a light jacket into Zoe's carry-on, Dad asked when Michael was coming. I looked up. He was near the hall closet now, patting the pockets of the pants he planned to wear to the airport. "A little after 4, I reminded him. He nodded once, as though the answer had merely slipped behind something else in his mind. Nothing dramatic happened. No one fell silent. No ominous music existed outside our lives to warn me which ordinary mistake mattered. Dad was 70. People repeated questions. I repeated questions when I was distracted. Michael had once spent 10 minutes looking for the glasses that were sitting on top of his head and had not yet been stripped of his adult privileges. I let it go. A few minutes later, Dad began searching for his keys. Mom told him they were probably in the bowl by the door. They were not. He checked his jacket, the kitchen counter, and the bowl again before Zoe found them on a small shelf beside the linen closet. Dad laughed when she held them up. He had apparently set them there while moving something else. Zoe looked delighted to have solved the mystery. I remember smiling. Michael had mentioned Dad's forgetfulness a few weeks earlier. We had been driving home from dinner at my parents' house when he said Gordon seemed different lately. Not dramatically different, just easier to lose in the middle of a conversation. Dad had asked Michael twice which school concert he was preparing for, and later forgotten where he had parked at a restaurant he had visited dozens of times. I had defended Dad before Michael had actually criticized him. He was 70. He wore hearing aids. He had retired from a profession where schedules and specifications once filled his head, and now most of his days were his own. I told Michael aging was not a crime, and that Dad would hate knowing his son-in-law was quietly keeping score of every misplaced key. Michael had not argued. That made it easy for me to decide the subject was closed. Standing in my parents' hallway that Saturday, watching Dad accept his keys from Zoe with an exaggerated little bow, I remembered the conversation only long enough to dismiss it again. Mom was more concerned with whether Zoe had packed the noise-canceling headphones we had bought for the flight. Zoe had not. The discovery caused exactly the sort of 11-year-old crisis that feels enormous for 60 seconds and then transfers responsibility to the nearest parent. She had left them charging beside her bed at home. We lived close enough that retrieving them was irritating rather than difficult, and there was still plenty of time before anyone needed to leave for Logan. I told Mom I would run back and get them. She waved me toward the door without looking up from the itinerary. Before I left, I reminded Zoe that Grandma was in charge until I came back. The sentence felt absurdly unnecessary, even as I said it. Mom had been taking care of Zoe since she was a baby. She knew our numbers, our pediatrician, our insurance, the food Zoe disliked, the way she became carsick if she read too long in the back seat. The signed medical authorization was sitting 6 feet away. Mom gave me the look she had used since I became a parent, whenever I explained something she considered obvious. I kissed Zoe's head. She smelled faintly of the coconut shampoo she had insisted, made her hair look better in travel photographs. Dad was adjusting one of his hearing aids near the kitchen. Zoe had already wandered in his direction. That was the last thing I saw before the front door closed behind me. I drove home thinking about headphones. For the next 40-something minutes, my life remained insultingly ordinary. I found the headphones exactly where Zoe had said they were, plugged into the outlet beside her bed. I unplugged them, checked the battery level, and noticed the sweater she had rejected that morning lying on the floor. I folded it automatically because mothers apparently continue doing small, useless chores, even when no one is there to appreciate them. Michael texted to say the school music room had finally surrendered the equipment he needed to lock away for summer, and that he would be home sooner than expected. I sent him a thumbs up and told him I was retrieving the sacred headphones. I never made it back to my parents' house. My phone rang while I was backing out of our driveway. Mom's name filled the screen. I answered with the headphones on the passenger seat, and one hand still on the gear shift. Her voice was wrong, not loud. Mom became quieter when she was frightened. The efficiency usually sharpened into clipped instructions, as though terror could be managed if she kept every sentence short enough. She told me Zoe had suddenly started coughing and then could not breathe properly. An ambulance had come. They were already taking her to the emergency department. For several seconds, I sat with my foot on the brake even though the car was no longer moving. Mom kept talking. Zoe had been with Dad. It had happened fast. She had turned blue. The paramedics were working on her. I needed to go directly to the hospital, not back to the house. Those were the facts I had. Nothing about a battery. Nothing about a small object. Nothing about why my healthy 11-year-old daughter had gone from packing for Paris to being unable to breathe in the space of one trip home for headphones. I left the headphones on the passenger seat and drove. I remember almost nothing about the roads except red lights. They seemed to appear with personal malice. At one intersection, I watched a man cross in front of my car carrying a paper bag from a bakery, moving at a perfectly reasonable speed that made me want to scream at him to run. I did not. My hands were locked around the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles hurt. Michael called once. I told him the hospital and 3 facts. Zoe, breathing, ambulance. He said he was coming. That was enough. By the time I reached the emergency department, my parents were already there. An ambulance crew member had brought Zoe in cyanotic blue around her lips, with barely effective airflow, and the first team had moved quickly from oxygen and airway assessment into imaging because her breathing remained abnormal, even after she was moving more air. I did not understand most of that when it was first told to me. What I understood was that I could not see my daughter. A nurse met me before I could push beyond the doors and explained that the team was with her, that Zoe was receiving oxygen, that they were trying to determine what had blocked or was still affecting her airway. Her words were calm. The emergency department around her was not. Phones rang behind the desk. Rubber soles squeaked against polished floors. Somewhere out of sight, a child was crying, with the furious stamina of someone healthy enough to protest whatever the adults were doing. I would have given anything for Zoe to be making that much noise. Mom sat in a molded chair beneath a wall-mounted television. Her handbag was on her lap. Dad sat beside her, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. Their luggage was still in the car, Mom told me. They had followed the ambulance as soon as they could. I asked what Zoe had been doing when it happened. Mom's answer was so simple, I had nowhere to put my fear. Zoe had been near Dad. She had started coughing. At first they thought she had swallowed wrong. Then she could not catch her breath. Dad rubbed one hand against the other and said nothing. I asked whether she had been eating. Mom said no. Whether she had fallen? No. Whether she had complained of feeling sick? Not that morning. After that, the questions became useless because neither of them had an answer that made the event understandable. I stopped asking. The doors opened twice without Zoe appearing. A respiratory therapist went through. Then someone in dark blue scrubs crossed the waiting area carrying equipment I could not name. A doctor introduced herself as Naomi Feld and gave me a brief explanation about the chest images showing something that might be obstructing a lower airway. A specialist airway team was being brought in. She did not drown me in terminology. She told me what mattered. Zoe was being oxygenated. They had identified a problem they needed to address, and they would update us. Then she disappeared behind the doors. Time stopped behaving normally after that. 5 minutes could vanish. 30 seconds could become a room. I watched the second hand of a clock above the nurse's station move through complete circles without understanding why time was allowed to continue when Zoe was somewhere I could not reach. Mom watched time too. At first I assumed she was doing what I was doing, counting minutes, because there was nothing else to control. Then I noticed she was switching between the clock and her airline app. She refreshed the screen twice. The first time, I said nothing. The second time, she enlarged the itinerary and stared at the departure line long enough that the brightness of the phone reflected against her face. Dad finally looked up and asked whether there had been any update. I told him no. He nodded and turned his gaze toward the hallway. Mom began quietly calculating whether they could still reach Logan if the hospital released them soon enough. I watched her move between the clock and the airline app until she muttered that their rotten luck might cost them the business class tickets. The complaint was already in the hook. Hearing it again in the lived sequence needed only the fact, not a second full replay. Dad said staying there would not change anything. He sounded tired, rather than deliberately cruel, but I had no spare part of my mind for that distinction. I moved 3 chairs away. Mom stopped talking about the itinerary, though the airline app remained open in her hand. Michael arrived a few minutes later, with his shirt untucked, and sat beside me. When he covered my hand with his, I noticed the pale crescents my fingernails had pressed into my palm. I gave him only the medical facts. Dr. Feld had given me. Something was in Zoe's airway. A procedure was underway, and we still did not know what had caused it. I could not yet bring myself to repeat what my parents had said about the flight. The doors opened again. Dr. Feld came toward us. She had a tablet tucked against one arm. On the screen was a chest image marked with an arrow near a bright circular shape. In her other hand was a transparent specimen, cup so small that at first I thought it was empty. Then she held it closer. A tiny silver disc sat at the bottom. I knew what a button battery looked like. A tiny flat silver disc, ordinary enough until you imagined it inside a child's airway. I still had no idea how it had gotten into Zoe. Dr. Feld's face had changed from the careful neutrality she had worn earlier. She was still professional, still controlled, but there was an edge to the question she asked. Who can explain why this was in her airway? The room went still, in a way hospitals rarely do. Mom's phone slipped from her fingers. It struck the vinyl seat beside her, bounced once and fell onto the floor. She did not reach for it. Dad had gone pale. Not the ordinary drained color of a frightened grandfather waiting for news. Something in his face seemed to empty all at once. His hand rose instinctively toward his right ear, toward his hearing aid. My eyes followed it. Then I looked at Mom. Her handbag was open. One of the small travel pouches she had been carrying all morning sat across her lap, partly unzipped. Near her fingers was a little plastic battery case, the kind I had seen in their house often enough, without ever giving it a thought. The battery case beside Mom's open handbag was the same kind that held Dad's hearing aid batteries. More telling than the case was what disappeared from both their faces. The clock, Logan, the boarding time, the seats. Dr. Feld waited while my parents stared at the specimen cup. Dr. Feld waited. I watched my mother's mouth move before any sound came out. That's Gordon's. I looked at the tiny battery in the specimen cup, then at the hearing aid behind my father's ear. My daughter was 11 years old. There was only one question left in the room that mattered. Then why was my 11-year-old daughter handling it? My question hung between us longer than it should have. Then why was my 11-year-old daughter handling it? Mom's eyes moved from the specimen cup to me, then past me toward the doors where Zoe had disappeared. For once, she did not have an answer ready. Dad's hand was still near his hearing aid, 2 fingers resting behind his ear, as though he had forgotten why he had lifted them. Dr. Feld did not let the silence turn into a family argument. She told us Zoe had come through the bronchoscopy safely, but the battery had irritated the lining of her airway, and the period of low oxygen meant they wanted her monitored. There would be more information once she was awake enough to assess properly. She spoke in the stripped-down language people use when they know a frightened parent can only carry a few facts at a time. Zoe was breathing. The battery was out. She was not going home that night. Everything else could wait. I followed Dr. Feld through the secured doors with Michael beside me. My parents stayed behind. I did not ask them to come. The first thing I noticed about Zoe was how small the hospital bed made her look. At home, 11 had begun to stretch her into elbows and opinions and shoes that seemed to become too short overnight. In that room, under a white blanket, with oxygen tubing beneath her nose and monitoring leads disappearing beneath the neckline of her gown, she looked younger. Her eyes were closed. There was dried adhesive at one edge of her cheek, where something had been removed. A pulse oximeter glowed red against one finger. The room smelled faintly of plastic, antiseptic, and whatever dry, chilled air hospitals seemed to manufacture in unlimited quantities. Michael stopped near the foot of the bed. I knew what he was doing because I was doing the same thing. Counting, chest rise, pause, chest rise. The monitor showed us numbers, but neither of us trusted numbers yet. We watched her breathe as if vigilance itself might keep the next breath coming. A nurse explained that Zoe was still sleepy from anesthesia and that her throat would hurt. The airway team had seen irritation where the battery had been lodged. They had removed it before it caused the kind of prolonged tissue damage small batteries could cause elsewhere in the body, but the doctors were not treating that as permission to be casual. They wanted oxygen monitoring, repeated respiratory checks, and another assessment before anyone discussed discharge. I nodded through all of it. There are times when information enters you cleanly, and times when it merely stacks itself somewhere for later. That afternoon, I could repeat words like mucosal injury and observation, but what I understood was simpler. My daughter had stopped breathing. A metal battery had been inside her. My parents recognized it. I sat beside Zoe and placed my hand near hers without touching the taped IV. Her fingers were warm. That nearly undid me more than the monitors had. A warm hand was such an ordinary thing. I had held that hand crossing streets, walking into kindergarten, pulling her up from the floor after she tripped over a scooter. I had never once thought of warmth as evidence that a future still existed. Michael pulled the visitor chair closer to mine. Neither of us spoke for a while. When Zoe opened her eyes, she looked at the ceiling first, then at me. Her brow tightened, as if I were the confusing thing in the room. She tried to speak. What came out was barely more than air. I leaned closer and told her not to force it. She swallowed, winced, and closed her eyes again. Her fingers moved beneath mine until she found my thumb. That was enough. We spent the next hour in pieces. Nurses came and went. Dr. Feld returned once with a shorter explanation of what they would watch for overnight. Zoe drifted in and out. Michael went downstairs to move his car from a short-term area and came back carrying a paper cup of coffee I forgot to drink. At some point, my parents appeared at the door. Mom had retrieved her phone. Dad looked older than he had that morning. I did not invite them farther into the room. Mom asked how Zoe was doing. I gave her the same broad information the doctor had given me. Stable, being monitored, sore throat, staying overnight. Then I asked again about the battery. Mom's explanation came carefully. She said Zoe had always been interested in little gadgets. Dad carried spare hearing aid batteries in a small case. Maybe she had found one. Maybe she had been curious. Kids put things in their mouths without thinking. Even at 11. The whole thing had happened so quickly that Mom could not say exactly when Zoe picked it up. She made it sound like an unfortunate collision between childhood curiosity and bad luck. Dad did not contradict her. He also did not support her with anything precise. When I looked at him, he stared at the floor beside Zoe's bed and rubbed one thumb along the side of his index finger. He said he remembered Zoe being near him. He remembered coughing. Hers, not his. After that, everything blurred into panic. That was not enough to prove Mom wrong. It was also not enough to make her version feel right. I thought of the tiny battery case on her lap in the waiting room. I thought of Dad's hand rising toward his hearing aid the moment Dr. Feld showed us what had been removed. And I thought of my daughter at breakfast. "Grandpa, did you take the blue one?" Little pieces had begun collecting around me. None of them formed a picture yet. Mom tried once to soften the atmosphere by saying the important thing was that Zoe was safe. I looked at the oxygen line beneath my daughter's nose. Safe was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Michael shifted beside me, not enough to interrupt, but enough that his knee touched mine. He had a way of reminding me he was present, without taking over whatever space I was standing in. Mom eventually left, saying Dad needed to sit down somewhere quieter. I watched them go without asking when they planned to return. Only after the door closed did Michael ask the question that should have occurred to me earlier. Not why Zoe had put a battery in her mouth. Why had she known where Dad's spare batteries were in the first place? He did not say it accusingly. That almost made it harder to dismiss. I started to answer the way I usually did when someone raised a small concern about my parents. Zoe spent time with them. Kids notice things. Dad's hearing aids were not a secret. Then I stopped. Knowing that your grandfather wore hearing aids was one thing. Knowing where the spare batteries were kept was another. I looked toward Zoe. She was asleep again. The next morning, Michael arrived looking as if he had packed for a natural disaster. He had gone home for a few hours because one of us needed to shower and bring clothes, and I had expected him back with my sweater, Zoe's charger, and maybe a toothbrush. Instead, he came through the door with an overnight bag, Zoe's soft gray blanket, her headphones, 2 books, a sweatshirt, 3 charging cables, a stuffed fox she had not slept with in almost 2 years, and a collection of snacks that included things the nurse had already told us. Zoe could not eat yet. He set everything beside the window. Zoe, awake enough by then to look offended by the world, stared at the pile. Her voice was still rough, each word scraped thin by the tube and the irritation in her throat. "Dad, I'm staying one night, not transferring schools." Michael froze with a granola bar in his hand. For the first time since my mother's phone call, I laughed. It came out wrong. Half laugh, half something that caught beneath my ribs, and I pressed my lips together before it turned into crying. Michael looked at the bag, then at Zoe, and admitted through a solemn nod that he might have overpacked. Zoe's mouth lifted at one corner. That tiny expression did more for me than the previous hour of normal monitor readings. She was still there, not just breathing, still herself. For the rest of that morning, we tried to let her be sick without making her responsible for the mystery around her. Nurses checked her oxygen. She managed ice chips, then small sips of water. She complained that swallowing felt like she had a scratchy broom in there, which was close enough to medically useful that I nearly asked the nurse to chart it. I did not ask her about the battery. Not immediately. I had spent the night replaying the previous day, but Zoe had spent it recovering from anesthesia and struggling to breathe. My need for answers did not outrank her need to feel safe. Mom called twice. I let both calls go to voicemail. Mom's messages asked for updates and repeated that she and Dad loved Zoe. I never doubted the love. Dad had built model bridges with her, and Mom had slept on our couch when she was sick. That history was exactly why the battery and the silence around it were so difficult to place. By Sunday afternoon, Zoe was alert enough to become bored, which everyone treated as excellent medical progress. She wanted her tablet, then did not want it, because looking down made her throat uncomfortable. She asked if she could go home. She asked whether Paris was completely ruined or just delayed. I told her we were not thinking about Paris yet. Her eyes moved away from mine. It was a small reaction. I might have missed it before Saturday. Now I noticed. I asked if she was worried Grandma would be upset. Zoe shook her head carefully against the pillow. She seemed more concerned about Grandpa. That made sense. The battery had belonged to him. The incident had happened while she was near him. Children often attach guilt to whatever piece of a disaster they can understand. I told her Grandpa had adults with him and that she did not need to worry about anything except getting better. She nodded. 10 minutes later, while I was helping her reposition the blanket, she looked toward the digital clock on the wall. "Did Grandpa take the blue one?" The question stopped my hands. It was the second time in 2 days she had asked it. I sat back down. I kept my voice ordinary. I asked what she meant by the blue one. Zoe looked surprised that I did not know. Dad's lunchtime medication came from the blue section of the organizer Mom used when they traveled. Zoe knew because Grandpa sometimes forgot whether he had taken it, and she had begun reminding him. She explained it with the same casual tone she might have used to tell me who fed the cat, which was what made the next pieces harder to hear. Over the next hour, between respiratory checks and complaints about hospital gelatin, she described the rest in ordinary fragments. She sometimes found Grandpa's wallet, remembered hotel room numbers when he mixed up the floor, stayed beside him in crowded places so he did not turn the wrong way, answered repeated questions without embarrassing him, and quietly told Grandma when he seemed mixed up. None of those tasks had arrived as one frightening assignment. They had accumulated as small favors inside a relationship Zoe loved. I thought about every time we had praised her for being mature. At home, ordinary responsibility meant feeding a neighbor's cat or remembering her own library book. This was different. An 11-year-old had begun tracking whether a 70-year-old man had taken medication and whether he knew where he was. I did not put that conclusion on Zoe. I asked who had started calling her Grandpa's helper. Zoe frowned. Not helper. Grandpa's little co-pilot. The pride in her face hurt. Dad had taught her navigation years earlier. Co-pilot sounded like an extension of their old game. It sounded special. It sounded like trust. Mom had found the perfect word. It did not sound anything like responsibility. Zoe explained that Grandma used it when she did something useful without being asked twice. Dad used it too sometimes, usually when she found a place on a map or remembered where they had parked. I pictured the two of them walking through Paris, Zoe beside Dad, believing she had been promoted into an adventure. The hardest part was how normal Zoe made the helping sound. She did not describe herself as scared or overworked. She described competence. She liked knowing where Grandpa put things. She liked getting an answer right before the adults did. At home, we had encouraged that same pride in smaller ways. Feeding a neighbor's cat, making scrambled eggs, remembering her own school deadlines. Nothing about responsibility itself was the problem. The problem was scale. Somewhere between ordinary chores and family affection, the adults around her had stopped noticing that remembering medication, orientation, and another person's confusion belonged to a different category. Zoe had not crossed that line knowingly. She had simply kept accepting the next small thing, because each one looked like another chance to be trusted. I asked whether she had ever told Michael or me about all the things she was doing. She looked at me with the guarded confusion children get when they suspect there is a correct answer, but do not know which one it is. Then she said she had told me some things. She was right. That realization arrived without mercy. She had told me Grandpa lost his wallet, and she found it. She had told me she remembered the hotel room when he did not. She had once bragged that she knew which pills were morning ones and which were after food. I had heard every one of those things as family anecdotes. Smart kid, forgetful Grandpa. Nothing more. Zoe had not hidden every fact from me. I had simply never assembled them. I rubbed my thumb along the edge of the hospital blanket. I asked if Grandma had ever told her not to tell me. Zoe's shoulders moved slightly beneath the gown. Not exactly, she said. That phrase tightened something inside me. Mom had not told her to lie. She had told her I worried. She had said I sometimes made things into a bigger deal because I was Zoe's mother, and mothers did that. If I knew Grandpa needed a little extra help, I might worry about the trip. I might change plans. I might cancel things. Zoe repeated the idea without judgment. From an 11-year-old's point of view, it probably made sense. Adults kept harmless surprises from each other constantly. We did not tell Dad what his birthday present was. We did not tell Grandma which dessert we ordered before she arrived. Children learned early that not all withheld information was a lie. Mom had placed this secret in that harmless category. Don't worry your mother. Don't spoil the trip. Grandpa is fine. Just help. I kept my expression steady, because Zoe was watching me now. The last thing I wanted was for her to decide that honesty had caused another emergency. I told her she had not done anything wrong by helping someone she loved. Her fingers picked at a loose thread on the blanket. I also told her that if an adult ever asked her to keep something from Michael or me, because we might cancel things, that was exactly the sort of thing we needed to know. She nodded, but I could see she was not ready to understand why. Neither was I. Later that afternoon, Mom and Dad came back. Dad had changed shirts. Mom had not. The navy blouse she had worn to the hospital the day before was slightly creased now. The polished travel version of my mother beginning to come apart at the edges. Zoe brightened when she saw Dad. That mattered. Nothing in her face suggested fear of him. Dad stayed near the foot of the bed at first, as if he did not know whether he was permitted closer. Zoe lifted one hand weakly. He moved to her side and took it. I watched them together and hated how much tenderness could coexist with everything I had learned. Mom spoke mostly about practical things. She had contacted the airline. The tickets were no longer usable as booked. Some taxes and possible credit might eventually be recoverable, but several prepaid pieces of the itinerary were gone or uncertain. She gave me those details as though I had asked. I had not. Then she returned to the battery. Her position had hardened since the previous day. Zoe must have taken it herself. She was curious. She liked little objects. Dad could not remember handing her anything. I looked at Zoe. She was watching her grandfather, not Mom. I asked Mom one question. If Zoe had taken the battery herself, how had she known where the spare batteries were? Mom barely paused. Zoe spent time with them. She had seen Dad change them before. She liked helping. There it was again. Helping. Michael was standing behind my chair. I felt rather than saw him shift his weight. Mom continued before either of us could respond, explaining that children picked up family routines. Zoe knew where they kept tissues, chargers, mints, bandages. Batteries were no different. She made the comparison so smoothly that for a moment I almost accepted it. Then Zoe glanced toward Dad's hearing aid. The gesture was small. I stored it away. We did not have a confrontation. Zoe was exhausted, and I had no interest in making her hospital room, the place where 4 adults decided which version of her life was acceptable. I told my parents we would talk later. Mom disliked the boundary. I could see it in the way she pressed her lips together, but she did not challenge me in front of Zoe. They left after less than 20 minutes. Dad kissed Zoe's forehead before he went. She closed her eyes when he did. On Monday morning, the hospital social worker confirmed that a mandated report had been made because Zoe had suffered a serious injury while under someone else's supervision, and the explanation around the foreign body remained unclear. By early afternoon, Marisol Vega contacted us. She asked who had been supervising Zoe, how long I had been gone, who currently had permission to care for her, and whether my parents would be alone with her while the circumstances were being clarified. My answer to that last question was no. Until I understood how Dad's battery had entered Zoe's airway, neither grandparent would be responsible for her without Michael or me present. After the call, I looked at Zoe asleep in the bed and saw the contrast more clearly than before. The child I knew forgot juice glasses in her bedroom, left wet towels on the floor, and could spend 20 minutes choosing a font before forgetting to put her name on a school project. The child I had been hearing about since the bronchoscopy remembered a grown man's medication, wallet, room numbers, directions, and moments of confusion. Someone had quietly turned ordinary helpfulness into a job. When Zoe woke later, she was tired enough that her defenses had thinned. We talked about going home once the doctors were satisfied with her breathing. She asked if Grandpa would be okay without Paris. I told her Grandpa had Grandma and other adults around him. She studied the blanket. I reminded her that looking after Grandpa was not her job. That was when her face changed. Not dramatically. Her forehead tightened. Her mouth turned down slightly, as though I had corrected her on something she had believed she was good at. But I help him. I told her I knew. She stared at the pulse oximeter clipped to her finger. Then she closed her eyes. For a few seconds, I thought she had ended the conversation. When she spoke, her voice was still rough and tired, and the words came with the simple certainty of something she had never considered a secret. Grandma said Grandpa does better when I'm there. Zoe came home late Monday afternoon, with a discharge packet folded into my purse, a raw throat, and instructions that somehow managed to be both reassuring and terrifying. After 2 nights of stable oxygen levels and repeated checks, the doctors were satisfied that the battery was gone, that there was no immediate sign of another obstruction, and that the irritation seen during bronchoscopy could be followed at home. We had numbers to call, warning signs to watch for, and appointments that would come later. What we did not have was an explanation that made the previous 3 days fit together. Michael drove us home because I no longer trusted myself to pay attention to traffic and Zoe at the same time. She sat in the back seat, wrapped in the gray blanket he had brought to the hospital, even though the June heat had settled over the car before the air conditioning caught up. Her headphones rested in her lap. The same headphones I had gone home to retrieve. I kept seeing them on the passenger seat of my car the moment Mom called. At home, Zoe went straight to the couch rather than her bedroom. That was unlike her. She had spent the previous year insisting that our living room was badly designed because the sofa faced the television instead of the windows, yet she curled into the corner without complaint and tucked her feet beneath the blanket. Michael set her water on the coffee table. I was carrying a paper pharmacy bag from the hospital, even though there was nothing dramatic inside it. Pain relief. Instructions. A few ordinary things that had acquired enormous importance because they belonged to the category of keeping my child comfortable. Zoe watched me arrange them. Then a spoon slipped from the drying rack in the kitchen. It hit the tile with a bright metallic clatter. Zoe jerked so violently that the blanket fell from one shoulder. Her hand flew to her throat. I was beside her before the spoon stopped moving. She was breathing. I knew she was breathing. Still, I watched her chest until the panic left her face. Michael picked up the spoon and placed it silently on the counter. No one called what had happened anything. Zoe pulled the blanket back around herself and asked whether she could have the television on. I turned it on. That became our first rule after the hospital without anyone formally making it one. We did not turn every reaction into a conversation. If Zoe wanted to talk, we listened. If she wanted to watch an animated movie she had already seen 4 times, we let the movie carry the afternoon. The medical emergency had given us enough people asking questions. Home needed to become somewhere she could stop answering them. Mom texted before dinner. I saw her name on my phone and turned the screen face down. She wanted to know how Zoe was. She wanted to know whether the doctor had said anything more. She wanted to know when they could come by. I did not answer immediately. 2 days earlier, that would have felt cruel. I had spent most of my adult life responding to my mother quickly, even when there was no urgency. She had built our family around communication that flowed through her. Birthday plans, holiday dinners, Dad's appointments, Peter's moods, family news that should probably have gone directly from one adult to another somehow arrived through Mom first. My silence that Tuesday was not punishment. It was space. I needed enough room to think without my mother supplying the shape of what I should think. Zoe fell asleep before 7. Michael and I ate standing at the kitchen counter because sitting at the table felt too formal for the exhaustion in our bodies. I kept glancing toward the living room, where the blanket rose and fell over Zoe's side. Michael did not bring up my parents until the dishes were in the sink. He said Peter had called him. That made me look up. My brother and Michael got along, but they were not men who called each other casually. They saw one another at family events. They exchanged jokes about yard equipment and the Red Sox. Every few months, one of them sent the other a link to something mechanical. Neither of them intended to buy. Peter calling Michael meant he had heard about Zoe. Apparently, Mom had told him there had been an accident. That word irritated me more than it should have. Accident was technically true. It was also a word large enough to hide almost anything inside it. Peter had asked whether Zoe was safe. Michael told him she was home. After that, Peter had said something strange. He asked whether Dad had been alone with her when it happened. Michael did not press him. He told Peter I would call when I was ready. I leaned both hands against the counter. For several months, Peter had been drifting farther from my parents. I had known that. I had also accepted Mom's explanation for it, with embarrassing ease. According to her, Peter had become fixated on Dad getting older. He had started treating every forgotten appointment and every misplaced object like evidence that something was terribly wrong. He had pushed too hard about Dad's driving. He had gotten into an argument about medication. Mom said Peter meant well but had always been intense when he believed he was protecting someone. I knew my brother well enough for that description to sound plausible. Peter had always moved quickly once he believed something was unsafe. As a teenager, he once wanted to shut off half the house during a minor basement flood before Dad convinced him the water was nowhere near the wiring. He was often right, and capable of making being right exhausting, which made Mom's description of him as an overreactor easy for me to accept. Peter's intensity had always made him easy to dismiss when everyone else wanted calm. When we were teenagers and the basement flooded, I carried towels while he wanted the electricity shut off, before Dad convinced him the water was nowhere near the wiring. At 19, Peter called the city because a damaged stop sign had been leaning at an intersection for 2 days. He was often right, but he had a talent for making correctness exhausting. Remembering that helped me understand why Mom's version of him had worked so well on me. She did not have to invent a personality for him. She only had to take a real trait and use it to make the substance of his warning feel less important than the way he delivered it. The memory of the last argument came back while I stood at my kitchen counter. It had been in March. We were at my parents' house for Sunday dinner. Dad had gone upstairs after dessert. Peter waited until he was gone before saying he did not think Dad should be driving longer distances alone for a while. Mom had stiffened instantly. I remember her fork resting on her plate. Peter explained that Dad had gotten turned around recently on a route he had driven for years. Mom said it had been one wrong exit. Peter said that was not what worried him. He wanted someone else involved in medication too, at least temporarily. I had watched the argument gather weight and done what I usually did. I tried to make it smaller. I told Peter that turning normal aging into a family crisis would only humiliate Dad. I told him there was a difference between noticing changes and deciding someone was incapable. Those words sounded reasonable when I said them. They still sounded reasonable in isolation. What bothered me now was how little I had asked before saying them. I had not asked where Dad had ended up. I had not asked what medication issue Peter meant. I had accepted Mom's summary because it kept dinner intact. Michael rinsed a plate beside me. I told him I would call Peter after we had had one full day at home. That night, I checked Zoe's breathing more times than any doctor had instructed me to. The first time, she was asleep on her side. The second time, she had thrown the blanket off. The third time, sometime after 2, she opened one eye and caught me standing in her doorway. "You're being weird," she rasped. I retreated before my worry became her job too. Wednesday morning arrived humid and gray. Zoe woke, with less throat pain and more impatience. She wanted toast, then discovered toast scratched too much. She settled for yogurt and spent breakfast complaining that hospital gelatin should not legally be called food. It was the most comforting complaint I had heard all week. Michael stayed home. School was already out for summer, but he had been finishing equipment inventory and end-of-year cleanup with the music department. He sent a message saying someone else could survive the saxophone cabinet for one day. Peter came over just before 11. I had decided against a phone call because I did not want to spend the next hour staring at a wall while trying to decide which pauses mattered. I wanted to see my brother's face. He looked almost exactly like he always did, tall, slightly rumpled, carrying the permanent expression of a man who believed most objects had been assembled less efficiently than necessary. He did not rush toward me with questions. That helped. He checked on Zoe first. She was upstairs resting by then. I gave him the broad medical update and told him she was not ready for visitors. Peter accepted that immediately. Then the 3 of us sat at the kitchen table. Michael had made coffee. Peter took one sip. He looked down into the mug with the concentration of someone identifying an industrial solvent. "Is this coffee, or are you cleaning the machine?" Michael glanced toward the pot. "I teach teenagers how to play trombone. Coffee quality stopped mattering years ago." The corner of Peter's mouth moved. I laughed once despite myself. The sound disappeared almost immediately, but I was grateful for it. For a few seconds, we were just 3 tired adults in a kitchen insulting coffee. Then I placed both hands around my mug. "What happened with Dad?" Peter stopped smiling. He leaned back slightly, and the difference in his face told me this conversation had been waiting longer than I knew. He did not begin with a diagnosis. He began with a drive. In late January, Dad had gone to pick up something from a hardware supplier, about 25 minutes from home. It was a route he had taken countless times during a renovation project. He left shortly after lunch and was supposed to be back before 3. Mom called Peter after 4 because Dad had not returned. His phone went straight to voicemail. Peter drove the route. He checked the store. Dad had been there. The clerk remembered him leaving hours earlier. By the time Dad finally called, nearly 3 hours had passed since he should have been home. He was in a town north of where he intended to be, parked behind a pharmacy, with a dead phone he had managed to charge briefly after asking someone inside for help. Peter described the facts without dramatizing them. Dad had taken a wrong road, then another. At some point, he stopped recognizing enough landmarks to correct himself. He kept driving because he believed the next familiar road would solve the previous mistake. It never did. My fingers tightened around the coffee mug. That was not the story Mom had told me. She had called it a wrong exit. Peter saw recognition in my face. He said Mom had not technically lied. Dad had taken a wrong exit. She had simply removed everything after it. When Peter brought up the incident at Sunday dinner, Mom had already spent weeks helping Dad turn it into something harmless. Bad signage, a road closure, a dead phone, winter darkness. Any one of those things could happen to anyone. Together, Peter believed they deserved attention. I stared at the steam rising from my coffee. I remembered telling him not to make Dad feel incompetent. The shame did not arrive as a dramatic blow. It settled lower, like weight added gradually to something already strained. Peter continued. The medication problem happened the following month. Nothing catastrophic occurred. Dad did not end up in a hospital. He did not collapse. That mattered. I needed to hear the actual scale, instead of allowing hindsight to transform every past mistake into a warning siren. Dad had taken a routine medication in the morning. Later, he apparently forgot he had taken it and took another dose. Peter learned because Dad called him irritated about the pill organizer Mom had bought. He complained that the compartments were confusing. During the conversation, Peter asked enough questions to realize Dad could not remember whether he had taken 1 dose or 2. Mom was out running errands. Peter went over. By the time he arrived, Dad felt fine. They called for medical guidance, monitored what they were told to monitor, and nothing serious developed. But Peter saw the 2 incidents together. A familiar route becoming unfamiliar. A medication dose becoming uncertain. He stopped seeing them as isolated annoyances. I asked why he had not called me then. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. He had tried to talk about it at dinner. I looked down. There are apologies you owe before you know enough to say them properly. That was one. Peter did not use it against me. He said he had also handled things badly. After the medication incident, he became too forceful. He wanted Dad to stop driving until someone evaluated what was happening. He wanted Mom involved in every medication dose immediately. He approached Dad with the efficiency he used when dealing with a dangerous electrical problem. Identify risk, isolate risk, fix risk. Dad heard only one message. You are no longer capable. Mom made that interpretation worse. Peter described the argument without repeating every sentence. Mom told Dad that Peter wanted his keys, that Peter had decided one bad afternoon meant he should be treated like an invalid, that if they allowed Peter to take over, he would turn every normal lapse into proof that Dad could no longer run his own life. The phrase struck me, because I remembered Mom using almost the same language with me later. Peter is treating him like an invalid. I had thought it was an observation. It had been her framing. Dad became furious. Peter responded by becoming more forceful. Within minutes, a legitimate concern about safety turned into a fight over dignity. Dad told Peter to mind his own business. Peter left. Mom called me later and described my brother as overreacting. I believed her. The refrigerator motor hummed behind me. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Zoe moving in her room. The ordinary sound made what Peter was describing worse. I asked whether Mom had ever told him Zoe was reminding Dad about medication. His expression changed. No. One word. That was all it needed. He knew Zoe and Dad were close. He knew they did little puzzles and navigation games. He had seen Zoe hand Dad his wallet, or remind him where someone parked at a family event, but he had assumed those were normal grandparent-grandchild moments. He had not known she was tracking medication. He had not known Mom called her Dad's co-pilot. He had not known Zoe believed Dad did better when she was there. Peter pushed his coffee away. The movement was small and angry, in a way his voice was not. Michael admitted he had seen smaller signs, too. Dad repeating a question at dinner, then letting Zoe lead everyone back to the car after a school performance. He had mentioned the changes to me before and backed away when I dismissed them because he did not want to become the son-in-law evaluating my father. Hearing him say it now left none of us completely innocent. Peter had pulled back after pushing too hard. Michael had deferred to my family boundary, and I had trusted Mom's harmless explanation because it required the least disruption. Saturday had not begun on Saturday morning. I asked Peter what happened after the argument. He looked toward the kitchen window. Dad stopped speaking to him for almost a week. Then, unexpectedly, Dad called. Not Mom, Dad. He told Peter he had agreed to see someone, a specialist. Peter had pushed for a medical evaluation, but once Dad finally agreed, Mom took over the logistics. She arranged appointments and made it clear Peter's involvement was no longer needed. Peter decided that if Dad was being assessed, that was what mattered. He backed off. I asked if he knew when the appointment happened. Late March. My parents had never mentioned it. I had seen them 6 times since then. Easter, 2 Sunday dinners, Zoe's spring concert, Mom's birthday lunch. Dad had sat beside me during all of them. No one said specialist. No one said evaluation. No one said anything had changed. My first instinct was anger at Peter for keeping that from me. It rose quickly, familiar and useful. Then, I remembered his face when I dismissed him at dinner. I asked instead why he had not told me. He rubbed his palm once across the tabletop. Dad had called him after the appointment. He was upset, embarrassed more than frightened. Dad had told Peter after the appointment that no one had declared him incapable, and he wanted time to understand the evaluation before the rest of us began treating him differently. Peter agreed because he believed it was still Dad's medical information to share. He told me now that he would have made a different choice if he had known Zoe was already compensating for Dad's memory gaps. Mom, meanwhile, kept postponing the disclosure even after Dad's promised conversation never happened. Peter said that after a few weeks he asked Dad whether we had talked. Dad seemed uncertain about what he meant at first. Then he said Mom thought there was no reason to worry me until they knew more. Peter called Mom. That conversation ended badly. She accused him of starting the same fight again. She said Dad had been evaluated, and there was no emergency. She told Peter to stop turning a medical issue into a family referendum. Peter withdrew. He had not spoken to Dad about it directly since April. I walked to the sink and looked at Zoe's water bottle drying beside the faucet. The pattern was no longer abstract. A pill reminder, a hotel number, a wallet, a direction. Adults had divided responsibility into pieces small enough for a child to carry without anyone naming the weight. Michael came to stand near me, but did not touch me. Peter remained at the table. No one rushed to fill the silence. I turned back. I needed the actual term, not another family interpretation. Peter said Dad had been angry about the tests and frightened by what they might mean, but the doctor had given the changes a name that was neither dementia nor a declaration of incapacity. Dad had asked Peter to let him tell me himself. Weeks passed, and he never did. Peter's voice had lost its usual sharpness by the time he finally said it. Dad told me they called it mild cognitive impairment. He asked me to let him tell you himself. His eyes moved toward the staircase where my daughter was resting. Mom made sure that day never came. For several minutes after Peter said the words, mild cognitive impairment, I did not ask another question. The phrase did not sound dramatic enough for what it did to the room. If he had said dementia, I might have known what fear to reach for. If he had said Alzheimer's, my mind would have filled itself with images I had collected from other people's lives, names forgotten, houses made unfamiliar, adult children introduced as strangers. Mild cognitive impairment was different. It sounded almost administrative. A label designed not to frighten anyone. Maybe that was why my mother had been able to bury it so easily. Upstairs, Zoe moved around in her room. I heard a drawer open, then close. Michael's terrible coffee still sat cooling on the table. Peter had stopped touching his cup entirely. I asked him what the doctor had actually said. Peter could give me the term but not the full assessment. He had not been in the examination room, and Dad had told him only pieces afterward. I wanted the report, the doctor's notes, some clean document that would settle what the family had spent months arguing around. But Dad was an adult, and wanting access did not make his medical information mine. I called him, instead. I called my father. He did not answer. Mom did. I almost hung up when I heard her voice. Instead, I told her I knew Dad had been evaluated. There was silence on her end long enough for me to hear the faint hum of something electrical behind her. Then she said Peter had no business discussing Gordon's private medical information. Mom's first response was not surprise, but privacy. She said the appointment had been precautionary, that the word mild mattered, and that Peter had once again turned ordinary aging into a crisis. She never denied the evaluation. She kept reducing its weight: precautionary, mild, follow-up, nothing urgent, until it sounded like something that required no change at all. I asked to speak to Dad. Mom said he was resting. I told her I would come by later. She tried to discourage that too. Zoe had only just come home. Dad had been under enough stress. Everyone needed a few days to recover. That sentence almost worked on me. It sounded compassionate. It also postponed the same conversation that had apparently been postponed since March. I told her I would call first. Then I ended the conversation. Peter watched me set my phone down. He did not look triumphant. That helped more than I expected. If my brother had smiled or said he had warned me, I might have found somewhere to place my anger besides myself. Instead, he stood, carried his untouched coffee to the sink, and said he needed to get back to work. Before he left, he paused near the stairs. Zoe was standing halfway down. I had no idea how long she had been there. She wore one of Michael's old-school t-shirts that hung nearly to her knees. Her hair was pulled into a loose knot, and the bruise from her IV still shadowed the back of her hand. Peter smiled at her. She waved. Nothing in her face suggested she had heard the words cognitive impairment. I was grateful for that. Not because the diagnosis was shameful, because I did not yet know how to explain it, without making Zoe think she had caused something. That afternoon I read enough to understand one essential distinction. Mild cognitive impairment was not the same thing as dementia, and did not automatically erase Dad's independence. I did not want fear to turn him into a diagnosis before I had even heard his own account. At the same time, the diagnosis now sat beside facts I could not dismiss: the long drive home, the double medication dose, and Zoe's growing habit of remembering things for him. When Michael came home, we talked about what we actually knew. Dad had been evaluated. Mom had minimized the evaluation. Peter had seen meaningful changes. Zoe had been helping in ways neither Michael nor I had understood. The battery had belonged to Dad's hearing aid. We agreed not to fill the remaining gaps ourselves. Dad still needed to tell me what the specialist had actually said to him. The next morning was Friday, July 3rd. Dad called before I could call him. He sounded tired. Not confused, not fragile, just tired. He said he knew Peter had told me. I waited. Dad told me he wanted to explain in person. That was how I ended up back at my parents' house less than a week after I had left Zoe there, believing it was one of the safest places she could be. Michael stayed home with her. That had been my decision. I did not want Zoe sitting through another adult conversation about herself or Grandpa. She had already spent too many days surrounded by adults discussing what had happened while watching her face for clues. Mom opened the door. The travel paperwork was gone from the dining table. The luggage that had been waiting for Paris had disappeared too. I did not ask where she had put it. Dad was sitting near the back window with a folder on the table beside him. Not a secret file. Not something I had discovered. His. He touched it once before I sat down. Mom took the chair beside him. For a few seconds, none of us spoke. My father looked exactly like the man I had known the previous week. Same gray hair. Same hearing aids. Same old watch with the scratched metal clasp. There was something almost offensive about how unchanged he looked. Then he told me Peter had used the right term. Mild cognitive impairment. He said it carefully, without looking at Mom. The specialist had explained that it described measurable changes in memory or thinking greater than what they expected from normal aging, but not the same thing as dementia, and not proof that he had lost the ability to manage his own life. Dad held on to those distinctions. I understood why. He had spent 40 years as an engineer. His identity had been built around competence so quietly that I had never thought of it as pride. He remembered measurements, routes, dates, structural tolerances. He was the person who could stand in an unfamiliar neighborhood and somehow know which direction was north. Now other people were evaluating the reliability of his memory. He hated it. I could see that without him telling me. His fingers kept pressing the corner of the folder flat, though it was already flat. He said the doctor had not told him he could never drive again, had not declared him incapable, had not diagnosed Alzheimer's. Mom leaned into those facts immediately. She said that was exactly what she had been trying to explain. Peter had taken cautious recommendations and turned them into a crisis. People heard the word impairment and imagined a man who could not find his own kitchen. Dad's jaw tightened. I could not tell whether he agreed with her or simply disliked the description. I asked what had actually been recommended. Mom answered first. She summarized it as follow-up, healthy routines, keeping an eye on things. I looked at Dad, not Mom. He stared at the folder for a moment. Then he opened it. He did not hand me every page. He did not need to. Dad showed me the after-visit summary he had chosen to share. The language was measured. Follow-up testing, better medication organization, family observation of changes, and caution with situations that demanded complicated navigation or multiple steps under stress. Nothing on the page declared him incapable or said Paris was impossible. The ambiguity made the situation harder, not easier. Because of the driving and medication incidents, however, the specialist had recommended simplifying complex travel until follow-up clarified more. If Dad traveled, someone capable of handling medication, navigation, unexpected changes, and emergency decisions needed to be reliably available. An adult. Mom immediately pointed out that she was exactly that experienced, organized, and fully capable of handling travel. I agreed. The question was why Zoe had also been taught to remember Dad's medication. What unsettled me most was how well Mom's old strengths could hide the new problem. She had organized our family for as long as I could remember. Appointments went on calendars, medication went into labeled containers, travel documents went into clear sleeves, and every practical task had an owner. She understood better than anyone what happened when responsibility became vague. That was why the arrangement around Dad felt so strange once I could finally see it. The largest tasks still belonged to adults, but the smaller gaps had been allowed to drift toward Zoe because each one looked harmless by itself. I could also understand the fear underneath Mom's resistance. She had spent more than 40 years beside a man whose competence shaped their life together. Watching him lose small pieces of certainty must have been frightening. Understanding that fear made her choices human. It did not make the burden on Zoe acceptable. Then I asked why Zoe needed to remember his medication. Mom's face changed by a fraction. She said she did not need to. Zoe liked helping. I asked about hotel room numbers, directions, wallets, walking beside Dad when he became confused in crowds. Mom's hands folded together on the table. Those were not medical responsibilities, she said. They were little things, family things. Zoe liked feeling grown up. Cute little jobs. The phrase landed badly. I thought of Zoe in a hospital bed asking whether Grandpa had taken the blue pill. Cute was not the word that came to mind. Dad shifted in his chair. He said Mom was right about one thing. Zoe did like helping. She remembered things better than he did sometimes. The admission came out with a faint smile, almost affectionate. He talked about how quickly she learned subway maps, how good she was at remembering room numbers, how she could navigate a hotel after walking through it once. I knew all of that. Those were the qualities he had encouraged in her since she was little. What disturbed me was not Zoe's competence, but what the adults around her had begun doing with it. I asked Dad how often he relied on her. He frowned. Not often, in his view. Dad said he did not rely on Zoe often. Everyone reminded everyone of things, and he had never asked her to take care of him. I believed he had never used those words. No formal assignment had been necessary. A reminder here, a direction there, an answer to a repeated question, small enough to feel affectionate until the pattern belonged to a child. I was not trying to turn ordinary forgetfulness into evidence. I was trying to understand when affection had become responsibility. I looked at Mom. She had been the organizer in our family my entire life. She understood systems better than most people understood their own kitchens. She knew what happened when responsibility had no clear owner. Yet, she had allowed pieces of Dad's support to slide toward an 11-year-old. When I asked why neither Michael nor I had been told about the evaluation, Mom returned to Dad's dignity. Peter had made him feel watched, she said, and she was trying to give her husband time to understand what was happening before the family reorganized his life around it. I could understand that fear. I could imagine how humiliating it would be to have adult children discussing your driving, medication, and travel before you had decided what the diagnosis meant to you. But while the adults protected Dad from feeling managed, Zoe had quietly become part of the way he was managed. Mom insisted she was his granddaughter, not a solution. The two roles had begun overlapping anyway. Dad pushed the folder slightly away. His face looked exhausted. I did not want the conversation to become a trial, so I stopped. I told them I needed time. Mom said they did too. I left without resolving anything. At home, Zoe was sitting cross-legged on the living room floor with a half-finished puzzle spread around her. Michael was in the kitchen making sandwiches. The television was off. Afternoon light had turned the floorboards pale. Zoe looked better than she had in days. Still tired. Still careful when she swallowed. But better. I sat on the floor beside her. She was trying to find the edge pieces. For a while we worked without talking. That was what I needed. Something with boundaries. A picture that could only be completed one piece at a time. Michael came in carrying plates and said something about Grandpa needing more adult support than we had realized. He meant it quietly. He did not know Zoe was listening. Her hand stopped over the puzzle. She looked up. Did I do it wrong? The question hit harder than any accusation my parents had made. I moved closer. I told her no. Nothing about this was because she had done her job badly. Her forehead wrinkled. That word job had been mine, not hers. I corrected myself. There should not have been a job. Grandpa needed adults to help with certain things. That did not mean he was helpless. It did not mean he could not do normal things. It meant medication and travel problems belonged to grown-ups. Zoe considered that. Then her eyes moved toward the kitchen, where Michael had set down the plates, and apparently decided disappearing would make him less involved. "Dad's an adult," she said. "He forgets his keys every morning." From the kitchen came Michael's voice. "I heard that." Zoe's mouth twitched. Mine did too. For a few seconds, the pressure in the room loosened. It mattered that we could still laugh. Not at Grandpa. Not at what had happened. At ourselves. At the fact that adulthood had never magically cured anyone of misplacing keys. When the moment passed, Zoe returned to the puzzle. She said Grandma never acted like Grandpa was sick. That word made me pause. I had not used sick. Neither had Michael. Zoe explained that Grandma said Grandpa's brain got tired sometimes, especially in busy places. If he forgot something, you helped without making a big deal. If he asked again, you answered again. If he got turned around, you did not announce it so everyone could hear. I picked up an edge piece and turned it in my fingers. Those rules had kindness inside them. That was what made them difficult to challenge. Do not embarrass someone you love. Be patient. Help quietly. All good lessons. Until a child became responsible for hiding how much help an adult needed. I asked Zoe whether Grandma had ever explained why the trip mattered so much. She pushed two puzzle pieces together. They did not fit. She tried another. For a few seconds I thought she was ignoring me. Then she said Paris was supposed to prove something. I kept my voice neutral. "What?" She glanced toward the kitchen as if checking whether Michael was listening, then lowered her voice anyway. Grandma had said Uncle Peter worried too much. Peter thought Grandpa could not do normal things anymore. Paris would show him. Zoe said it with the confidence of someone repeating an argument she had heard but never understood. Grandma said Paris would show Uncle Peter Grandpa was fine. The puzzle piece in my hand suddenly felt too sharp at one corner. That was the first time the trip changed shape for me. Until then, Paris had been a gift. A grandmother and grandfather, taking their granddaughter somewhere beautiful while they were still young enough, healthy enough, fortunate enough to do it. Now another possibility had entered the room. The trip might also have been evidence. Proof. A demonstration staged against Peter's concern. If Dad could cross an ocean, manage airports, navigate trains, sleep in unfamiliar hotels, and return home smiling, then whatever the specialist had said could be folded back down into the word mild. I did not tell Zoe any of that. She had already been given too much adult meaning to carry. Instead, I asked when Grandma had first started talking about taking her. Zoe did not remember exactly. Spring. After one of Grandpa's appointments, maybe. I went still. The date existed somewhere in my own memory. Mom had called me excited, saying she and Dad had found the right flights and wanted to do something special with Zoe. I had been standing in the supply room at work, balancing my phone between my shoulder and ear while checking boxes for an arts program. I remembered how surprised I was. They had discussed taking Zoe abroad someday, but nothing had been fixed. Then suddenly Mom had the fares, the itinerary, the idea. I went upstairs and found the calendar where I still wrote family dates, despite having 3 digital calendars on my phone. Dad's specialist appointment was there because Mom had once described it to me only as a routine follow-up with a doctor. March 23rd. I opened my phone and searched our messages. Mom's first message asking seriously about Zoe's passport and whether Michael and I would allow a grandparents-only Paris trip had arrived March 26th. 3 days. I sat on the edge of my bed with the phone in my hand. 3 days after the neurological appointment, my parents had never explained to me. My mother had invited my 11-year-old daughter to cross the Atlantic with them. 3 days. Dad's specialist appointment had been March 23rd, and Mom's first serious message about taking Zoe to Paris arrived March 26th. The timing was not proof by itself. Families make plans around unrelated events all the time, and I knew how dangerous hindsight could be. But after the previous week, I no longer treated ordinary details as isolated simply because each one had an innocent explanation. By Monday, July 6th, I wanted to know what had happened between those dates. Michael sat beside me while I scrolled through old messages. Before Dad's appointment, Paris had been a someday idea. After March 26th, the messages became concrete flights, passport questions, specific hotels, rail plans, and Zoe's school calendar. The notarized travel consent and medical information we signed later looked exactly as responsible as they had at the time. What paperwork could not show was what Zoe was expected to do once the trip began. There was no hidden confession in the messages. The sequence itself was what mattered. I called Peter that afternoon. He did not sound surprised when I told him the dates. That worried me more than surprise would have. Peter took a while before telling me why. After Dad's evaluation, Mom had contacted him. Not to discuss the diagnosis. Not exactly. She asked whether he might be able to join them for part of the Paris trip they were considering. Maybe meet them there for several days and continue on one of the train legs. At first, Peter thought she was trying to repair the damage from their arguments. Then he noticed the way she asked. Could he handle one of the train stations? Could he make sure Dad had his medication on the travel days? Would he mind staying in the same hotel rather than somewhere nearby? Could he be flexible if Dad became tired or confused? Mom never called it support. She presented it as logistics. Peter recognized the difference, because logistics were how Mom had hidden half the family's uncomfortable truths for years. He told her he could not go. Work made it difficult, and more importantly, he thought Dad should finish follow-up before taking on an international itinerary built around unfamiliar airports, hotels, and rail connections. Mom became angry. Peter had already described enough of their history for me to imagine how the conversation changed from practical concern to dignity. He told me he had said something sharper than he should have. If Dad needed another adult to help manage the trip, maybe the trip itself needed to change. Mom heard that as another attempt to control Dad. The call ended badly. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the date on my phone. I asked Peter when that conversation happened. March 24th, the day after the appointment. 2 days later, Mom messaged me about Zoe's passport. The pattern did not require an investigator. Mom looked for an adult backup. Peter said no. Then Zoe became the special guest. I did not say that out loud. Not yet. I needed to understand whether there was another reasonable explanation. There usually was, at least at first. Peter reminded me that he did not know the final itinerary. He had no idea how much Mom eventually expected Zoe to do. Maybe Patricia genuinely wanted the trip for sentimental reasons too. That was fair. My parents adored Zoe. I refused to rewrite every loving memory simply because I was angry. But Peter had given me one new fact I could not put away. Mom had wanted an additional adult on the trip before she invited my daughter. By Tuesday, Zoe was feeling well enough to sit at the dining table for lunch, instead of eating on the couch. Her voice had mostly returned, though it still became rough if she talked too long. She was beginning to complain about being watched, which I took as another sign of recovery. She caught me looking at her while she poured juice. "Mom!" I looked away. She narrowed her eyes. I had apparently reached the stage of motherhood where concern itself became embarrassing. I spent the next 10 minutes pretending to be deeply interested in a grocery receipt. That afternoon, I asked her about Paris. Not about Grandpa, not about pills. Paris. I wanted to know what she had imagined the trip would be. Zoe brightened immediately. The reaction hurt more than if she had withdrawn. She had made a list. Of course she had. It lived in the Notes app on her tablet under the title, "Things Paris Needs Me to Do," which made me laugh before I even knew what was on it. The first few items were predictable. See the Eiffel Tower. Eat a croissant larger than my face. Find a bookstore where everything looks old. Then she reached number 7. Find out whether French fries are actually French. I told her they were not. She stared at me with genuine offense. That feels like false advertising. Michael, passing through the kitchen, said the French probably had bigger problems than defending themselves against American potato terminology. Zoe ignored him. She added a note beside the item anyway, apparently unwilling to close the case without independent verification. For a few minutes, Paris belonged to her again, not to the battery, not to Dad's diagnosis. The strange thing was that Zoe's excitement about Paris had never been fake. Her tablet still held screenshots of buildings she wanted to see, a list of pastries she intended to rank, and a photograph of an absurdly narrow bookshop aisle she had announced she needed to experience in person. She had practiced 3 French phrases and mispronounced all of them with confidence. For weeks, the trip had given her the uncomplicated pleasure of looking forward to something. I did not want the new truth to steal that memory from her too. The problem was not that Paris had secretly been a punishment, or that my parents had never wanted her company. The problem was that a child's excitement had been laid over an adult need she was not old enough to recognize. The same itinerary could hold both things at once, a real gift and a hidden job. That was what made the discovery harder than finding a simple lie. Not to Mom's planning. It was pastries, old buildings, badly researched potatoes, and a bed on an airplane. I needed that moment before I asked the next question. I kept my tone casual. What kinds of things did Grandma say she would be responsible for on the trip? Zoe did not understand why the question mattered. That helped her answer naturally. At first, Zoe named ordinary expectations. Carry her backpack, stay close in airports, know the hotel name in case they were separated. Then the other preparations surfaced. Grandma had shown her Dad's medication pouch and which compartment was which. Zoe was supposed to notice if he left it behind, stay beside him at train stations while Grandma dealt with tickets, remember platform and room numbers, guide him back if he got turned around, and make sure he knew where Grandma was, if she stepped away. None of it sounded frightening in Zoe's voice. The instructions had not arrived in one speech. They came on walks, over maps, during packing, and after little moments when Grandpa forgot something. No adult had announced that she would help compensate for his cognitive changes. The burden had grown from favors that still felt like affection. When I asked what Grandma would do without her, Zoe said Grandma could do everything. It would simply be harder. She explained that Grandpa sometimes bristled when Grandma corrected him, while he usually laughed if Zoe reminded him. Sometimes Zoe noticed he was confused before Grandma did. She said that last part proudly. I had spent 11 years teaching my daughter to pay attention, be useful, and take pride in competence. I had never imagined those strengths becoming infrastructure for an adult. When Zoe noticed my face and asked if she had done something wrong, I told her no. I did not tell her Grandma had used her. That sentence belonged to my anger, not her childhood. I asked instead why Grandma wanted her on the trip. Zoe answered first that they loved her. I told her I believed that. Then she added that Grandpa was easier when she was around. He listened to her, did not feel fussed over, and accepted her corrections without the same embarrassment. The understanding was no longer about whether Mom was capable of being the adult. It was about how Zoe made adult help easier for Dad to tolerate. I stepped into the bathroom for a minute so Zoe would not have to read my face. My parents would have enjoyed traveling with her. That truth had not vanished. But another truth now sat beside it. Her presence made the itinerary easier in ways she had never been old enough to understand. That night Michael listened while I laid out Peter's invitation, its timing, and Zoe's expected role. He pointed out something I had been avoiding. Mom had never seriously invited us to join. I would have watched Dad differently after repeated mistakes, questioned the train connections if he became confused, and slowed or canceled part of the itinerary if it seemed unsafe. Zoe had been taught the opposite instinct, to help smoothly and not make him feel watched. I could not know exactly how consciously Mom had weighed those differences, and I refused to turn inference into mind reading. But behavior had created an outcome whether or not she had narrated the motive to herself. Peter had refused to be adult backup. I would have challenged the plan, and Zoe made the plan easier to preserve. The next morning, I called Mom. I asked whether she and Dad could come to our house without bringing Zoe gifts, food, or anything designed to make the visit feel normal. She did not like the wording. She came anyway. Dad looked uncomfortable from the moment he entered. Mom looked prepared. She had tied her hair back and wore the expression she used when approaching complicated airline representatives. Michael remained in the house but gave us space. Zoe was upstairs. I did not want her listening. I told my parents what Peter had told me. Mom's posture changed when I mentioned that she had asked him to join the trip after Dad's evaluation. She said Peter had exaggerated the conversation. I did not argue about exact phrasing. I told her I knew enough. She had considered needing another adult. Peter declined. 2 days later, she began actively arranging for Zoe to come. Mom rejected the connection. Paris had always been something they wanted to share with their granddaughter. Dad supported that. He said they had talked for years about taking Zoe abroad when she became old enough to appreciate it. I knew that was true. I told them I knew. The agreement seemed to unsettle Mom more than accusation would have. I was not claiming the entire trip had been fake. I was asking what else the trip had become. I summarized the responsibilities Zoe believed she would carry in Paris: watching the medication pouch, remembering room and platform numbers, staying with Dad in crowds, and noticing when he was confused while Mom handled something else. Mom said I was making small acts of kindness sound sinister. Dad repeated that Zoe liked helping him. I agreed that she did. That was precisely why adults needed to notice when helpfulness became a role she was too young to evaluate. She loved being Grandpa's co-pilot. Loving the role did not make the responsibility age-appropriate. Mom's hands tightened together. She insisted Zoe was never responsible for Dad. She would have been there. She was capable. She had handled far more complicated travel situations than this. I agreed again. Then I asked why she had asked Peter to come. Silence. Dad looked at her. It was the first moment I saw uncertainty move between them. Mom finally said she thought having another adult for part of the trip might be pleasant. I let the explanation sit there. I did not need to tear it apart. It was weaker than the silence around it. I asked Dad something else. If Zoe had not been going, would he still have wanted to take the same itinerary? He looked toward the window. For several seconds, he did not answer. Mom stepped in, saying that question was unfair. Dad was still perfectly capable of traveling with his wife. I had not asked her. Dad eventually said he did not know. That was more honesty than I expected. He liked having Zoe there. She was good company. She made things easier. There was that word again. I asked how. Dad smiled faintly, almost apologetically. She remembered things. She did not fuss. She did not make him feel watched. I looked at Mom. The trip finally made sense as a system. Mom would handle tickets, hotels, staff, and the formal logistics. Zoe would fill the quieter gaps that made Dad easier to manage without making him feel managed. Dad existed between them, protected from the appearance of needing much help because one adult handled the visible problems while a child absorbed the smaller ones. If it all worked, they would return with photographs from Paris and the train journeys that seemed to prove Peter and the specialist had worried too much. Zoe would never know her memory, and patience had helped create that appearance. That was why co-pilot had worked so well. It sounded adventurous and equal, an extension of the map games Dad had taught her, not like caregiving. I told my parents I believed they loved Zoe and had genuinely wanted her company. I also believed her usefulness had become part of why they needed her. Mom's mouth tightened. Dad closed his eyes. Neither gave me a clean denial. The trip was still a gift. It simply was not only a gift anymore, and that distinction changed what I could allow next. Later, I found Zoe at the table with the Paris list open again. The child's wishes: Eiffel Tower, oversized croissant, bookstore. The still unresolved French fries question now sat beside room numbers, the medication pouch, and staying close to Grandpa. The same page held both the vacation she wanted and the job she had not understood. Zoe asked whether Grandma and Grandpa were still mad. I said they were upset. She looked down. Then she asked the question I had been dreading. Did they only want me because I helped Grandpa? I wanted to answer immediately. That instinct frightened me. Parents learn how to soften reality before children even finish asking about it. No, sweetheart. Of course not. They wanted you because you're wonderful. The sentence would have been comforting. It also would not have been completely true. I moved my chair closer. I told her Grandma and Grandpa loved her. I told her I believed they wanted her company, her jokes, her excitement, all the things that made traveling with her fun. Then I told her something else had become mixed into that love. They had begun depending on her for things that should have stayed with adults. Zoe stared at her list. Her thumb rubbed the edge of the tablet case. So they didn't want me because I'm fun. The question was so much smaller than the problem. That was what broke me. She was not asking whether she had been parentified. She was not asking whether her grandparents had violated a boundary. She wanted to know if she was fun. 11. Just 11. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. I told her they did think she was fun. Grandpa loved her jokes. Grandma liked having her around. Their love for her was real, and so was the fact that adults had let something else become part of the reason they needed her. Zoe swallowed carefully. Her throat was almost healed, but I still noticed every swallow. She nodded. No speech, no dramatic tears. She closed the Paris list and asked whether she could watch television. I said yes. She left the room. The tablet remained in my hand. By then, the boundary was clear to me. This was not a permanent sentence on my parents. It was a safety correction while we understood what had happened. I called Mom that evening. I kept the conversation short because anything longer would have turned into the kind of argument where people repeat themselves until exhaustion feels like victory. I told her that for now, neither she nor Dad would be alone with Zoe. No overnight stays, no pickups, no weekends at their house without Michael or me, and no more trips where Zoe traveled as the only person besides them. Mom went quiet, and when she answered, hurt came before anger. She reached for the history of everything she and Dad had done for us: childcare, holidays, emergencies, and for the fear underneath it. She said Paris might have been one of Dad's last years to travel the way he always had, and that Michael and I had no idea what it felt like to spend decades building a life only to have your children begin defining what you could safely do. I believed her grief was real. I also knew the boundary could not depend on whether enforcing it hurt her. When she said I was taking away their granddaughter because I was frightened by a medical term, I told her the diagnosis was not the point. Zoe had been given adult responsibilities without our knowledge. Mom insisted she had never asked Zoe to do anything dangerous. The battery flashed through my mind, but I still did not know enough about those missing minutes to accuse her of more than I could prove. The rules we had made after the hospital still mattered. Do not fill missing facts with fear. Mom kept talking. Then she said the sentence that opened the next part of the story. You're acting like we almost killed her. Everything in me went quiet. I looked through the kitchen doorway. Zoe was curled on the couch under Michael's gray blanket, watching television with her feet tucked beneath her. Her breathing was steady now. The bruise from the IV had faded to yellow at the edges. Almost killed her. Mom had chosen the words. Not me. Until then, I had been focused on everything that led to the hospital. Dad's diagnosis, the hidden responsibilities, the trip, and the battery. Mom's sentence pushed me toward the missing 40-something minutes instead. She had been there when Zoe stopped breathing, spoken to emergency dispatch and the paramedics, and reached the hospital before me. I still did not know what she had known during those minutes. You're acting like we almost killed her. My mother's sentence stayed with me long after the call ended. I did not hear it as a confession. It was defensive, if anything. It sounded like the kind of exaggeration people reach for when they want the other person to seem unreasonable. But once the words existed, I could not stop noticing what they rested beside. Mom had been there. She had seen whatever happened between Zoe touching Dad's hearing aid things and Zoe losing the ability to breathe. She had spoken to emergency dispatch. She had stood near paramedics while they worked on my daughter. She had reached the hospital before I did. And yet when I arrived, the stories she gave me contained nothing except sudden coughing, sudden collapse, bad luck. By the middle of July, Zoe's physical recovery had begun settling into the kind of progress doctors liked and parents distrusted. Her voice sounded normal again most of the time. She could eat without wincing. Her follow-up had not shown a new respiratory emergency. I stopped waking every 2 hours to check whether her chest was moving. Though some nights, I still found myself standing outside her room before realizing how I had gotten there. The fear had changed shape. At first, I had been afraid Zoe might stop breathing again. Now I was afraid of what had happened before anyone called me. Marisol Vega contacted us again on a Wednesday morning. Her first contact after the hospital had been about immediate safety. Now the battery finding and the differences in the family accounts gave her more specific questions. Who had supervised Zoe, where the battery came from, what my parents had told me before the hospital, and whether the access boundary Michael and I had set was still in place. I answered what I knew, and stopped where I did not. I had not been in the room when Zoe choked. I could not say what Mom saw, or exactly when Dad understood something was missing. Even the small plastic battery case I had noticed beside Mom at the hospital told me only where I had seen it then, not who had been holding it earlier. The temptation to fill every empty minute was strong. I refused to turn inference into memory. Near the end of the call, Marisol explained that some emergency response records were being reviewed alongside the medical findings. The substance of the dispatcher documentation showed that the caller had been asked about choking or a possible object, yet no known foreign body concern had been reported. She did not hand me a transcript or ask me to interpret legal language. She told me what mattered to the safety question. I sat at the kitchen table after the call and stared at a knot in the wood. Mom had told me Zoe suddenly started coughing. Apparently, she had given dispatch the same broad story. No hearing aid, no battery, no small object. I still did not know whether she had known enough for any of those omissions to matter, but for the first time, there was an official record showing exactly what responders had not been told. Later that week, I contacted Dr. Feld through Zoe's follow-up care and asked one medical question. If the emergency team had been told at the beginning that Zoe might have inhaled a hearing aid battery, would that have mattered? Dr. Feld was careful not to invent an alternate outcome. Zoe had received airway support. Imaging had eventually identified the foreign body, and the airway team had removed it. What she could say was that a credible foreign body history would have moved aspiration higher on the diagnostic list and could have focused imaging and airway evaluation sooner. She did not claim Zoe definitely would have avoided hypoxia, or that every minute belonged to one person's decision. The point was simpler. Information about what might have entered a child's airway mattered, and Mom had spent her professional life understanding exactly how important small details became when something went wrong. By then, our house had started to sound ordinary again. Zoe complained about summer reading. Michael bought a cereal no one had asked for, and the basil plant on the kitchen windowsill leaned so dramatically toward the glass that Zoe declared it emotionally manipulative. Those small routines mattered, because the hospital had turned every hour into observation. At home, I wanted her to have stretches of time when nobody studied her breathing, memory, or expression. We ate dinner, folded laundry, argued about whether the air conditioning was too cold, and let silence remain silence. The unanswered questions were still present, but I tried not to make them the atmosphere of the house. When Zoe remembered another piece of the battery sequence, it came out of that ordinary space rather than from an interrogation, which made the fragment feel more trustworthy and, somehow, more painful. I did not ask Zoe immediately. That was another temptation I had begun learning to distrust. If I asked the same question enough ways, Eventually, an 11-year-old might give me something that sounded like an answer simply because she could tell I wanted one. I refused to make my daughter responsible for proving what adults had done. The memory surfaced on its own 2 days later. Zoe was sitting at the dining table working on a summer reading assignment she had complained was proof that school did not understand the definition of vacation. I was folding laundry nearby, mostly because being in the room with her still soothed some primitive part of me. She asked whether hearing aid batteries could roll. The question arrived without warning. My hand stopped inside one of Michael's t-shirts. I asked what made her wonder. Zoe frowned at the page in front of her. She remembered Grandma looking for one. That was all at first. I sat down but kept enough distance that the movement did not turn the moment into an interview. Zoe remembered Dad struggling with his hearing aid and trying to help him with the tiny battery. Both her hands were busy for a moment, so she put the battery between her lips without thinking. Something startled her. She sucked in a breath, and after that, her memory broke into coughing, pain, and adults moving around her. She could not reconstruct every second, and I did not ask her to. What she remembered next was Grandma searching the floor near Dad's chair. Zoe remembered Mom bending down, moving something with her foot and asking Dad, "Did you see where it went?" She had assumed they were talking about the battery. She could not tell me whether she was already on the floor or still standing when every piece happened. I told her that uncertainty was fine. I no longer had to guess how the battery had reached her mouth, and her memory placed Grandma searching for it before the ambulance arrived. I stopped there, rather than make an 11-year-old force frightened fragments into a cleaner chronology for me. I told her she did not have to force the memory into an order. She looked relieved. That reaction told me I had almost crossed the line anyway. I folded the rest of the laundry in silence while she returned to her reading. Inside me, something had shifted. The battery was no longer only an object the doctor had removed. It had existed in the room before the ambulance. At least in Zoe's memory, my mother had been searching for something small enough to disappear. I waited until Michael came home before I let myself say any of it aloud. He listened while I described exactly what Zoe remembered and exactly what she did not. He did not build the conclusion for me. We had both learned that lesson now. Still, after dinner, he walked to the cabinet where we kept spare batteries for the smoke detector and stood looking at the packages as if their size had changed. The following day, I called Dad. Mom answered the house phone. I hung up before speaking. Then I called his cell. He picked up after several rings. His voice sounded distracted. I asked whether he remembered the minutes before the ambulance came. The silence on his end was long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Dad said his memory of the minutes before the ambulance came was fragmented. He remembered the hearing aid bothering him, Zoe coughing, Mom moving quickly and looking near the chair or the edge of the rug. He remembered being confused about what everyone was searching for and could not tell me whether the 911 call came before or after Zoe began moving a little air again. When I asked about the hearing aid, his breathing changed. He remembered Mom saying something about not confusing the responders with it. He trusted the idea more than the exact words. In his memory, Zoe was coughing, people were moving, and Mom wanted the emergency team to focus on helping her rather than on the hearing aid. Dad admitted he had not argued. He also remembered realizing at some point that one of his batteries was not where it should have been, but he could not place that realization precisely before the call, during it or after paramedics arrived. The gaps embarrassed him because precision had once been part of how he understood himself. I did not need him to turn the scene into a perfect sequence. His account mattered because it independently placed the hearing aid and the missing battery inside the emergency, not because it erased every uncertainty. When we ended the call, I did not feel clearer. I felt worse, because uncertainty no longer protected my mother the way it had before. Zoe remembered Mom searching the floor and asking where something went. Dad remembered the hearing aid entering the conversation before or around the emergency response. The dispatch documentation contained no reported foreign body concern, and the object later removed from Zoe was exactly the kind of battery my parents had been looking around for. None of those things alone told me what Mom believed. Together, they made one version increasingly difficult to accept: that she had known nothing. The pieces still did not prove Mom knew the battery was inside Zoe. They showed something narrower. She had reason to think it might be. Zoe had begun moving some air again, and Mom could have seized on that improvement as proof the battery had rolled away. I could understand the impulse to choose the least frightening explanation. What I could not ignore was what saying the other possibility aloud would have exposed. A hearing aid battery meant questions about why Zoe had been handling Dad's medical device, how often she helped him, whether his confusion had become more serious, and whether the Paris trip depended on support nobody had disclosed. For months, Mom had kept those facts in separate boxes: a wrong turn, a medication mistake, cute little jobs, an ambitious vacation. A possible aspiration would have put them into one story immediately. I did not believe Mom wanted Zoe hurt. I believed fear collided with the same instinct that had guided her all spring. Keep the system moving. Choose the explanation that preserved the life she and Dad were trying to protect. And avoid opening questions she was not ready to answer. In a normal travel problem, that instinct made her efficient. During a breathing emergency, it made a serious possibility disappear from what she told responders. I called her that evening. I did not tell her everything Zoe remembered. I did not tell her everything Dad had said. I did not want to turn the call into a negotiation over witness details. I asked one question. "Did you think the battery might be inside her?" Mom inhaled. For a moment, I heard nothing except the faint background noise of their house. Then her defenses arrived. Everything had happened quickly. Zoe had been choking. Mom had been trying to call for help. Dad had been confused. There were bags everywhere because they were leaving for the airport. She was not a doctor. She did not know where a tiny battery had gone. Any of those statements could have been true. None answered the question. I asked it once more, not louder. Had she thought it was possible? Mom said she could not be expected to diagnose an airway obstruction while her granddaughter was in distress. There it was again. A change of wording. I had asked about possibility. She answered as if I had demanded diagnosis. I did not debate her. I did not tell her what the law might call anything. I did not threaten her with police, court, or prison. I ended the call. My hand shook afterward badly enough that I had trouble putting the phone on the counter. Michael found me there a few minutes later. I told him Mom had answered every question except mine. He stood beside me without offering an interpretation. We did not need one. The following week, Marisol called again. Her tone was more formal because the medical information, family accounts, and emergency response documentation had become serious enough for child protection to coordinate findings with law enforcement. She was careful about roles. Her office did not decide criminal charges, and neither my anger nor Mom's explanations would decide what police or prosecutors did with the evidence. I was surprised by how little satisfaction I felt. For days I had wanted someone outside the family to confirm that I was not imagining the danger. Once criminal review became real, I wanted the problem small again. Zoe sat across the room drawing on her tablet, while adults she had never met examined the worst minutes of her life. A few days later, an investigator contacted Michael and me and confirmed that the conduct around the emergency response was under review. No charge was announced. Life kept moving beside the investigation. The dishwasher broke. Zoe complained about a book. I bought groceries. Dad texted once to ask about her throat. Then, late one evening, my phone rang. Dad's name appeared on the screen. I was upstairs folding towels. Michael was downstairs with Zoe. The house was quiet enough that I could hear the air conditioner cycling on. I answered. Dad did not begin with an update. He did not ask about the investigation. He asked whether I was alone. Something in his voice made me sit down on the edge of the bed. I told him I could talk. There was another pause. Longer this time. When Dad finally spoke, His voice had none of the uncertainty I had heard when he tried to reconstruct the minutes around Zoe's choking. The sentence was simple. Your mother wasn't the only one who knew. Your mother wasn't the only one who knew. For a second I thought I had misunderstood him. Dad did not sound confused. He did not sound like he was searching for a word or trying to reconstruct the order of events. The sentence came quietly, and with enough weight that my body reacted before my mind did. I stopped folding the towel in my lap. The air conditioner clicked off, and the sudden silence in our bedroom made the phone feel louder against my ear. I asked what he meant. Dad breathed out slowly. He said he remembered more than he had told me. Not everything. Not cleanly. There were gaps around the minutes when Zoe was choking, and he did not trust himself to arrange them into a perfect sequence. But he knew he had understood enough to be ashamed of what he had not said. Before I could ask anything else, I heard movement on his end. A cabinet. Footsteps. Then my mother's voice somewhere behind him, indistinct but close. Dad lowered his own voice. He said he could not do this over the phone. Then the line went quiet. Not disconnected. Quiet. I waited. A few seconds later, he said he would call me again. The call ended before I could decide whether to be angry that he had opened the door and refused to walk through it. I sat on the edge of the bed holding a towel that no longer needed folding. Downstairs, Zoe laughed at something Michael said. The sound came through the floorboards. I put the phone face down beside me. The danger no longer belonged only to what Mom might have concealed. Dad had placed himself inside it. I did not tell Zoe. I did not tell Peter that night. I told Michael after she went to bed. He listened while I repeated the sentence exactly. He did not ask me what Dad meant, because neither of us knew. That had become one of the hardest disciplines of the previous month, allowing facts to remain incomplete. We were getting better at it. The next few weeks looked quiet from the outside, but Zoe began checking clocks. In the grocery store one afternoon, she noticed it was nearly 1 and asked whether Grandpa had taken his blue pill. When I said I did not know, her hand tightened around the cart and she immediately wanted to know which adult was remembering for him. I told her adults were handling his medication and follow-up now. She accepted the answer, then asked again the next day. For months, she had been taught that remembering for Grandpa was part of loving him. Removing the task did not remove the reflex. That evening, I ordered pizza because none of us had the energy for anything requiring more than opening a cardboard box. Zoe studied the toppings with the seriousness of a negotiator. She chose mushrooms and announced that she was not sharing them. Michael looked at the half of the pizza covered in mushrooms and told her no one had requested access. Good, she said. Then we understand each other. The line was so completely Zoe that I smiled before I could stop myself. She ate 2 slices. She did not ask about Grandpa's pills during dinner. I counted that as progress, though I hated that progress had become something measurable by the absence of an 11-year-old worrying about medication. A few days later, Mom called and talked about Dad. He was sleeping badly, moving through the house without doing much, and asking whether Zoe was angry with him. She reminded me, without quite saying so, of the grandfather who had taught Zoe maps, shown up for school concerts and driven across town when she forgot a project. The memories landed exactly where she intended. The changes were easiest to see in small moments that would have meant nothing before June. Zoe could spend 20 minutes arguing with Michael about pizza toppings and never glance at the clock. She could leave a water glass on the coffee table overnight, without remembering that Grandpa sometimes misplaced his. One afternoon, she disappeared into her room with a friend on video chat and emerged an hour later furious about a school group project that had nothing to do with medicine, travel, or adults. I found myself grateful for the irritation. Ordinary selfishness, ordinary boredom, ordinary 11-year-old priorities. Those were signs that the space inside her head was beginning to belong to her again. The old reflex had not vanished, but it no longer filled every quiet moment. That was why the question she eventually asked about Grandpa forgetting without her hurt so much. Underneath the improvement, she still believed some part of his stability depended on whether she remained useful. Then Mom argued that I was punishing a sick man for something he could not control. There was truth inside the pressure. Dad's cognitive changes were not a moral failure, and his diagnosis did not erase his dignity. None of that made Zoe responsible for easing his loneliness or returning to a role that had already harmed her. When Mom said he needed family around him more than ever, I told her he had family: Peter, me, medical professionals, and other adults. What he no longer had was automatic access to an 11-year-old as part of his support system. Mom's voice changed. She said I made everything sound clinical: support structure, boundaries, supervision, as if they were strangers. That word followed me after the call. Strangers. If a stranger had done exactly what my parents had done, how quickly would I have decided what was safe? The answer arrived later that night through Michael. We were loading the dishwasher after Zoe went upstairs. He had been careful not to tell me what to do about my parents. I appreciated that. The family was mine by birth, but Zoe was ours, and he had as much right to anger as I did. He rinsed a plate, then asked one question. If the person supervising Zoe that morning had been a babysitter, a neighbor, a camp counselor, anyone without the words Mom or Dad attached, would we let Zoe go back to their house alone while we were still trying to understand what they knew during the emergency? I stared at the water running over his hands. No, I would not. I would not call that cruelty. I would call it basic judgment. Family titles had been changing the standard. Again, Michael's question exposed how much family titles had softened my standards. Dad's forgetting became aging. Mom's minimizing became dignity. Zoe's burden became maturity. And Peter's concern became overreaction. I would never have treated the same conduct from a babysitter or teacher as harmless simply because they loved Zoe. I dried my hands and said the sentence the whole summer had been moving toward. Love was never the question. Michael looked at me. Safety was. I did not need to say it again. I called Peter the next morning because I owed him something, not because I needed more evidence. He came by after lunch. Zoe was in her room talking to a friend on video chat, and Michael had gone to pick up groceries. Peter sat at the same kitchen table where he had told me about Dad getting lost. This time I made the coffee. He drank it without insult. I apologized for dismissing Peter's concern as a personality flaw before I understood what he had actually seen. I had reduced him to the traits that made him easy to ignore: intense, impatient, too eager to solve things. Those traits were real. They did not make the underlying concern false. Peter surprised me by apologizing too. After Dad got lost, fear had pushed him toward ultimatums. Stop driving, hand over the medication, get evaluated now. He had made Dad feel as though having a problem meant losing his voice, and that gave Mom an easy version of him to fight. Neither of us tried to turn the past into a scoreboard. He had pushed too hard. I had looked away too easily. Mom had used the space between those mistakes. Before he left, the repair between us felt less like forgiveness than permission to speak directly from then on. Before Peter left, he asked how Zoe was doing. I told him about the clocks and medication questions, and his face tightened before he caught himself. Instead of declaring what Dad should never be allowed to do again, he asked what Zoe needed. That change mattered more than another argument about who had been right. I told him we were still figuring it out, and he accepted that. By the end of July, Zoe had stopped asking about the blue pill every day, but the worry kept changing form. She asked whether someone had written down Grandpa's next appointment and whether canceling Paris had somehow made him worse. When I said travel did not control his memory, she wanted to know whether he was sad. The guilt on her face showed me what I had missed. She was beginning to connect the canceled trip, the family arguments, and the loss of unsupervised visits to herself. One evening, I found her sitting on the floor beside her bed, sorting through the things she had packed for Paris. She had not unpacked all of them. The little travel journal Mom bought her was still empty. A plug adapter sat beneath it. There was a laminated card with the first hotel's address printed on it. Zoe picked up the card. She asked whether Grandma still had Grandpa's medication pouch. I sat beside her. I told her again that adults were handling it. She turned the hotel card over in her hands. Then the real fear finally came out. Not Grandma being mad. Not the investigation. Not even the battery. What if he forgets because I'm not there? The question cracked something open in me. Zoe was not worried about what Grandpa might forget. She was worried that her absence might cause it. I looked at her bare feet on the carpet. Her travel journal, her adapter, the list of French words Dad had written for her months ago. No 11-year-old should believe another person's brain depended on her presence. I moved closer but did not grab her. She needed the answer more than comfort first. I told her Grandpa's memory was not something she created and not something she could hold together. Helping him had never caused his good days. Stopping would not cause the difficult ones. Doctors and adults would take care of medication, appointments, directions, and travel decisions. Her job was school, friends, remembering when library books were due, if she happened to feel ambitious, remembering birthdays she actually cared about, and occasionally remembering that wet towels belonged somewhere other than the floor. That earned a small eye roll. Good. I wanted the eye roll. I wanted irritation. I wanted the parts of childhood that had nothing to do with being useful. Zoe put the hotel card down. She asked whether Grandpa knew she was not responsible anymore. I told her I would make sure he did. The answer satisfied her for maybe 30 seconds. Then another question replaced it. If Grandpa had been having trouble before the trip, why did everyone think he was okay? I could have protected her with an easier answer. Adults miss things. Grandpa had good days. Grandma did not tell us everything. All true. But Zoe was old enough to notice when truth had been padded until it became meaningless. I said all those things. Then I added that sometimes when she answered for Grandpa, remembered a room number, found his wallet, reminded him about medication, or guided him somewhere, she made the difficult moments less visible to the adults around them. Zoe looked at me. Her face changed slowly. Was I why people thought Grandpa was okay? There was no safe lie available. I shook my head. Not why. Not the whole reason. Dad really could still do many things. He really did have good days. He really was still himself. But her help had covered some gaps other adults should have noticed. I told her that was not her fault. It was ours to notice. Her mouth tightened. She stared at the empty travel journal. For a moment I thought she might cry. Instead, she slid the hotel card back beneath it and pushed the whole pile toward the wall. I don't want to pack Grandpa's stuff anymore. I told her she would not have to. That was the first boundary Zoe created herself. Not whether she loved him, not whether she would see him, only what role she refused to keep carrying. It was small. It was enough. Mom called again 2 days later and said Dad's sadness was getting worse because we had shut him out. I could hear real strain beneath the accusation. Without Zoe quietly filling gaps, more of Dad's needs had become visible and had returned to the adults around him. That consequence was not something I had designed, and I did not pretend caregiving for a changing spouse was easy. I offered to talk about appointments, Peter, and practical adult support. Zoe was not the solution. Mom said I had become cold. Through the back door, I could see Zoe trying to spray Michael with the garden hose and hitting the fence instead. Michael exaggerated his outrage. She laughed and chased him across the yard. Her body had healed enough that I no longer saw the hospital in every movement. Fear still returned in smaller ways. A metallic sound, a cough that lasted too long, noon on a clock. But the direction had changed. We were not teaching Zoe how to carry the burden more efficiently. We were teaching her she could put it down. Dad did not call for nearly a week after his sentence about Mom not being the only one who knew. I began to wonder whether he had lost his nerve. Part of me wanted to call him, Another part thought the next step needed to be his. He had spent months allowing Mom to shape what the family understood. If he wanted to change that, I could not do the changing for him. The call finally came on a warm evening at the beginning of August. Zoe and Michael were arguing good-naturedly about whether mushrooms belonged on leftover pizza. I was wiping the dining table when Dad's name appeared on my phone. I stepped into the hallway. His voice sounded clearer than it had on the previous call. He said Mom was not with him. Then he asked if I would meet him alone, not at the house, somewhere quiet. He said there was something I still did not understand about Paris. I waited. Dad took a long breath. Then he told me he wanted to explain why the trip had not only been Mom's idea. Why, after Peter refused to go, he had been the one who kept pushing for Zoe to come, and why having my daughter beside him had mattered so much more than I knew. Dad chose a small cafe near a public garden, where he and I had met for lunch a few times before his retirement. It was close enough to my parents' house that he did not have to travel far, but far enough that Mom could not hear the conversation from another room. I arrived first. That had never happened when I was younger. Dad was the person who arrived 10 minutes early, because 5 minutes early meant you had already wasted 5 useful minutes. He once made me leave for Logan 3 hours before a domestic flight, because traffic was a variable, not a promise. That afternoon I watched the minute hand on the cafe clock move past our agreed time. 2 minutes. 4. At 6 minutes late, Dad walked through the door. He was not lost. He was not frightened. He looked annoyed with himself. He had parked on the wrong side of the block and walked farther than he intended. I did not comment. The instinct to protect his pride still existed in me. What had changed was that I no longer confused protection with pretending. Dad sat across from me with his phone, glasses, and hearing aids on the table. For a while, we talked about Michael's school music program not because either of us had forgotten why we were there, but because difficult conversations still belong to ordinary life. Dad listened to my complaint about instrument inventory and said a school band should not need 14 clarinets to prove a point. I laughed. For a few seconds, he was simply my father, which was important because what came next did not erase that. Dad turned his coffee cup slowly between his palms. The smile disappeared. He said he had been thinking about Zoe's question. I knew which one without asking. Was I why people thought Grandpa was okay? I had not told him she said it. Apparently Peter had. That irritated me for half a second, until Dad explained that Peter had not repeated the whole conversation. He had only told Dad that Zoe was beginning to understand how often she had been filling gaps around him. Dad stared at the coffee. He said the answer was yes, not entirely, not always, but enough. That was where he began. Not with Mom, with himself. Dad said Zoe's help felt different from everyone else's. A reminder from Mom felt like correction. One from Peter felt like warning. Concern from me made him feel watched. Zoe simply answered the repeated question, pointed toward the car, or turned a forgotten room number into a game. She moved through the laps, without studying him afterward. That made him feel normal in the most personal sense of the word, not independent on paper, but able to move through a day without everyone adjusting themselves around him. Zoe gave him that because she loved him, and had not yet learned to treat every mistake as a symptom. He admitted he started relying on the feeling before he admitted he was relying on her. At first, the favors really were small. A parking level, a wallet, where Mom had gone. As they happened more often, he chose not to ask why. He simply let Zoe become better at smoothing them over. He had liked calling her his co-pilot. The nickname connected her help to the maps and landmarks he had taught her, making dependence feel like proof he had taught her well. It was easier to be proud of what she remembered than to ask why he had forgotten it. I did not interrupt. The cafe had become busier around us. Cups touched saucers. Someone behind the counter ran a grinder. Outside, a woman pushed a stroller along the path beside the garden. Across the table, Dad's hands looked exactly as I remembered them from childhood: broad palms, short nails, a pale scar over one knuckle from a woodworking accident when I was 9. Those hands had repaired loose railings, drawn diagrams on napkins, and taught me how to hold a level correctly. Watching them circle a coffee cup while he searched for words made the change in him harder to reduce to any diagnosis. He was not a different man sitting in front of me. He was the same man discovering that some of the skills he had built his identity around could no longer be trusted without support. That made his shame understandable. It did not make the choices harmless. If anything, seeing the person I loved so clearly made responsibility more complicated, because there was no villain's face to hide behind, only my father, frightened of becoming dependent and willing for too long to let a child make that dependence less visible. Dad spoke quietly enough that I had to lean forward. After the specialist appointment, Dad had been furious at the uncertainty more than at any single diagnosis. The words follow-up, caution, and adjustment sounded to him like the beginning of a life in which every drive, trip, and decision would be discussed by his children. He had spent 40 years being the person who knew the route and the measurement. Now people were watching whether he remembered them. Peter's forceful reaction made him resist harder. Mom helped him resist, and at the time he loved her for it. Dad did not blame her for inventing his denial. He admitted that she had protected something he already wanted protected. That admission changed the way I saw their marriage. Patricia had not simply hidden a diagnosis from a passive man. Gordon had also been choosing the version of his life that allowed him to feel unchanged. Dad told me that after Peter refused to join part of the Paris trip, Mom had considered simplifying the itinerary, dropping a train leg, staying longer in Paris, postponing another city. Dad hated the idea. The trip had become proof to him too. If he could complete it exactly as planned, he could tell himself the specialist's caution belonged to one bad stretch rather than a changed life. That was when he brought up Zoe. Not Mom. Him. He remembered telling Patricia that Zoe knows how I do things. The phrase had sounded affectionate in other contexts. Now he admitted what it meant. Zoe knew how to help without making him feel helped. Dad also knew the specialist wanted a reliable adult available for medication, navigation, and emergencies, and he knew Zoe was not that adult. His rationalization was that Mom remained responsible while Zoe only helped around the edges. Those edges were reminders, directions, room numbers, and small corrections. The same things that had allowed him to look less dependent than he was. He had not thought of Zoe as his caregiver. He had told himself she was extra help. But he knew by then that her presence made the itinerary possible in ways it would not have been without her. That was the line between simply benefiting from the arrangement and helping create it. I felt anger rise, but it did not arrive hot. It was colder than that. I had spent weeks trying to understand Mom's choices. Now I was looking at Dad and realizing he had benefited from the same system. He had not merely been carried inside it. He had asked for it. I thought of the morning on my parents' porch. Bonjour, merci, croissant. Zoe laughing. The moment still existed. Love still existed. That was exactly why the betrayal was painful. Dad seemed to know what I was thinking. He said he never wanted Zoe hurt. I believed him. The sentence did not excuse anything. He said he had imagined Paris as one last large adventure while he could still do it. I asked why Zoe had to pay for that adventure by becoming useful. He flinched. I had not raised my voice. I did not need to. Dad looked out the window. For a while, the only thing between us was the noise of the cafe. When Dad reached the choking itself, he did not give me a cleaner sequence than the one I already had. His memory came in flashes, the hearing aid bothering him, Zoe nearby, a sudden cough, Mom moving quickly, the battery case and the floor. Some images might have belonged before the choking, and some after. He refused to pretend otherwise. What he trusted was the thought underneath the fragments. He remembered thinking about the missing battery and wanting it to be on the floor. When Zoe began moving some air again, He latched onto the possibility that she had swallowed wrong or that the battery had rolled away. Any explanation that made the emergency smaller became easier to believe. He remembered Mom searching and remembered her saying not to confuse the responders with the hearing aid, though he still would not swear to the exact wording. He remembered himself staying quiet. That was the new information, not a more perfect timeline, but the fact that he could now name the wish that had shaped his silence. Dad said the possibility of the battery being inside Zoe had entered his mind. Even if he could not honestly say how completely he understood the medical danger in those confused minutes. He had known enough for the thought to exist and had not said it clearly enough. That was the limit of what he claimed to remember. It was also enough for the question I needed to ask him as his daughter. I asked the question I had carried since the investigation began. Not a legal question, not what he knew beyond a reasonable doubt. A daughter's question to her father. When she couldn't breathe, what were you protecting? Dad's eyes closed. For several seconds, he did not move. I could see his jaw working once, then stopping. There were many answers available. Mom, himself, the trip, his dignity, his marriage, the hope that the battery had simply rolled away. The version of our family where he was still the person who took care of things instead of the person people needed to watch. None of them was Zoe. Dad opened his eyes. He did not try to manufacture a better answer. He said he was protecting the life he thought he was losing. The words were barely above the room around us. He had wanted the trip. He had wanted Mom to stop worrying. He had wanted Peter to be wrong. He had wanted me never to look at him with the same concern he saw in people's faces after the specialist appointment. And when the battery became one more thing that could expose how much help he had needed from Zoe, part of him had wanted it not to be true strongly enough that he let silence become a decision. He looked down. There was no speech about forgiveness. I was grateful. He said there were pieces he did not remember. Other pieces he wished he did not. He would not use the missing ones to erase the ones that remained. That distinction was the first thing Dad had said that sounded like responsibility instead of defense. I asked whether Mom knew he was talking to me. He shook his head, then changed the answer. Not exactly. She knew he wanted to. She had told him the investigation was already twisting everything, and that anything he said now could make the situation worse. She wanted them to present one consistent account. Dad had spent weeks thinking consistency meant loyalty. Now he was not so sure. For most of the summer, I had pictured Mom pulling Dad behind her version of events. Now, I saw two people protecting the same illusion for different reasons. Mom wanted to preserve their freedom. Dad wanted to preserve his identity. Zoe had been useful to both. Neither had needed to be a mastermind. They only had to keep choosing the explanation that cost them least until the cost belonged to a child. I asked Dad what happened now. That was the first future-facing question of the afternoon. His answer was practical. He had scheduled another evaluation because he could no longer pretend the previous recommendations belonged to someone else's life. The criminal investigation had not forced that choice. Peter had offered to help with transportation. Dad had accepted. He had also agreed that medication would no longer be managed through memory and informal reminders. Mom could still participate if she wanted, but there would be a structured adult system around it. He would not ask Zoe. He would not let anyone ask Zoe. He had stopped driving for now. That mattered to him. I could tell by the way he rushed to clarify that nobody had permanently taken his license. He had chosen to stop until the next evaluation gave clearer guidance. I did not correct him. I told him I understood. He also planned to sign the medical authorization needed for Peter and me to join the conversations he wanted us involved in. He was clear that he was not surrendering every decision or every piece of privacy. He was ending the isolation that had made denial easier. I thought of Zoe asking who would remember for Grandpa now. This time, the answer was adults. Dad drank the last of his coffee. It had gone cold long before. I asked whether he expected Zoe to forgive him. His face changed. He said no. Good. I was not ready to hear anything else. He said he hoped to see her someday, but he understood that seeing her and supervising her were no longer the same thing. He would not ask to take her somewhere alone. He would not ask her to prove she trusted him. He would not ask me to make her reassure him. Those promises sounded more useful than an apology. Dad's willingness to change did not erase the months before it, the hospital, or the way he had allowed Zoe to soften a reality he did not want to face. I could recognize a different choice without pretending it completed his redemption. The cafe had emptied around us by then. A worker wiped a table near the door. Dad put on his glasses and checked his phone. For a moment, I saw uncertainty cross his face. Not about the conversation, about something on the screen. Then he found what he needed. I did not rush to help. Neither did he ask. That seemed important. He looked up. There was one more thing. Mom wanted him to tell investigators that he remembered nothing useful. Not to lie exactly. To emphasize the gaps, the confusion, the unreliability. All real things. She believed anything more would make it look as if she knowingly ignored the battery possibility. Dad admitted he had considered doing it. Marriage created its own version of co-piloting. You covered the person beside you. You filled their gaps. You protected their mistakes. At some point, loyalty and concealment could begin using the same gestures. He was done with that. He would tell investigators what he actually remembered and where the memory stopped. Nothing stronger, nothing softer, no convenient version designed to rescue Mom. I asked whether he understood what that could do to their marriage. He did. That answer came without hesitation. Dad finally looked directly at me instead of at his hands, his coffee, or the window. Your mother thinks if I admit this, I'm choosing you over her. He paused. I think I'm finally choosing what happened. By September, the emergency itself had stopped being the center of every day. That did not mean it was over. Zoe's breathing had returned to normal. The hoarseness was gone. Her follow-up appointments became less frequent, and the doctors were satisfied that the airway injury was healing the way they hoped. She still reacted to certain sounds. A metal cap dropped on a counter, a sudden coughing fit in a restaurant, but the reactions no longer swallowed whole afternoons. School started again. She complained about homework. Michael complained about the school copier. Peter began stopping by without every visit turning into a discussion about Dad. Ordinary life returned in fragments. The criminal review moved at a completely different speed. For weeks, the criminal review advanced, without a single dramatic breakthrough. The case strengthened because the same pieces began to support one another. Dispatcher and EMS documentation contained no foreign body warning. The medical record confirmed the hearing aid battery in Zoe's airway. Zoe remembered helping with the battery, and Mom searching for it. Dad independently remembered the possibility, the search, and his own silence. And Mom's explanations changed as the questions became more specific. The inconsistencies in Mom's versions were small rather than spectacular. At first, Zoe had simply begun coughing for no known reason. Later, Mom suggested curiosity, then said she had not realized a battery was missing, then said she had assumed it rolled away. None of those statements alone proved intent. Together with the medical timeline and the other accounts, they made the original story harder to sustain. I knew only what investigators and the prosecutor could appropriately share with us and what later entered the court process. No single piece carried the case by itself. Its strength came from the way the pieces converged. As fall went on, the prosecutor explained why Dad's case could not simply mirror Mom's. I had explicitly left Zoe under Mom's supervision that morning. Dad was not the primary caregiver. He was also the person whose cognitive changes had created the need for support in the first place. His fragmented memory, hearing difficulty and uncertain awareness during the critical minutes, also made the required criminal mental state harder to prove. He remembered enough to be morally ashamed. That was not the same as the state being able to prove conscious disregard beyond a reasonable doubt at the precise moment that mattered. The prosecutor did not tell me Dad had done nothing wrong. She told me the evidence did not support pursuing the same charge against him. At first, I wanted the law to measure the betrayal I had heard in the cafe. Eventually, I understood that my question to Dad, what he had been protecting while Zoe could not breathe, was a moral question, not a substitute for the criminal standard. Dad would still have consequences. Medical reevaluation, no driving while safety was reassessed, adult medication management, damaged trust, and supervised contact with Zoe. They were simply not identical to Mom's legal consequences. By October, Dad had followed through on the changes he promised. He was being reevaluated. He stopped driving while the safety questions were reassessed. Medication no longer depended on memory and informal reminders. Peter and I had access to the information Dad chose to authorize us to participate in, and we communicated directly instead of relying on Mom to translate everything. None of that turned him into a helpless man. He still made decisions. He still argued. He still disliked people touching his tools. He still believed Michael owned too many extension cords. He was simply no longer pretending every problem disappeared if nobody named it. Mom reacted differently. Once she had legal counsel, the language around the case became more polished. The battery event was described as panic, confusion, bad judgment during an emergency. Her attorney never claimed Zoe had invented anything. That would have been impossible. Instead, the argument narrowed Mom's responsibility to one terrible decision made during the worst few minutes of her life. I understood why. That was what lawyers did. They did not represent entire family histories. They represented legal exposure. Mom wanted something else from me. She wanted a sentence. Not for court. For herself. She wanted me to say she had not been herself that day. The request came through a phone call in late October. Her voice sounded smaller than it had all summer. She said people under stress made irrational decisions. That she had been terrified. That she had watched her granddaughter turn blue and could barely think. I believed all of those things. Then she asked whether I could at least the prosecution Horle Corling Horlen. Hoar leaves remained on the maple behind our fence. For months, I had resisted turning Mom into a monster, and I would not turn the emergency into an isolated accident for her either. I told her I would not exaggerate what she had done, or ask anyone to punish her for Dad's diagnosis, the Paris trip, or every family argument that came before it. I would also not say the omission appeared from nowhere. It belonged to the pattern of making each warning smaller, until the missing battery became one more fact she wanted not to matter. When she said she wished I could remember who she had been before all this, I did. She was the woman who carried backup copies of documents because details mattered in emergencies. She was the grandmother who had once slept on our couch when Zoe was sick. She was also the woman who had left a serious possibility unsaid while Zoe could not breathe. I did not need to erase one version to believe the other. Dad made his own choice during those months. Mom wanted him to emphasize the gaps in his memory and the parts he could not place. He refused. He told investigators what he remembered, what he did not, and where he was uncertain, the same limited account he had given me. When Mom learned that, something between them broke. Peter later told me she had started sleeping in the guest room some nights. Dad did not move out, and they did not announce a separation. 44 years of marriage did not collapse because of one statement, but the alliance that had depended on both of them, protecting the appearance that nothing had changed, could no longer function the same way. I did not celebrate that. Their marriage belonged to them. It was simply one more consequence no judge had needed to order. By November, the case was moving toward resolution. I was not included in every legal discussion, but eventually Mom agreed to plead guilty to reckless endangerment of a child. The word sounded enormous, because the family finally had language that did not shrink what happened. Autumn moved forward, while the case moved in paperwork, scheduled calls, and long stretches of nothing visible. Zoe went back to school. Michael returned to rehearsals and came home complaining about reeds, broken music stands, and students who believed tempo markings were optional suggestions. Dad attended follow-up appointments, and, for once, Peter and I did not have to learn about them through Mom. The ordinary rhythm helped, but it also made the court date feel stranger. A family could eat dinner, argue about homework and buy groceries, while a criminal case continued in another building. By the time sentencing approached, I had stopped imagining one dramatic moment that would make everything feel resolved. I wanted the process to acknowledge the danger without turning Zoe into evidence over and over again. I wanted Mom held responsible without pretending punishment could restore the version of our family that existed before June. There would be no trial. I was relieved for Zoe. She had already answered enough questions and did not need adults repeatedly pulling her back into the morning she stopped breathing. The plea did not require Mom to understand every emotional consequence. It required enough accountability for the criminal case to end, without asking my daughter to carry more of it. Sentencing was scheduled for December 4th. The morning was cold enough that the sidewalks outside the courthouse had white salt marks along the edges. Michael came with me. Zoe stayed in school. That decision was easy. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined. People entered carrying folders. Lawyers spoke quietly. Cases before ours came and went. Nobody seemed aware that the room contained what had once been the center of my entire family. When Mom entered, she looked older than she had in June. Not dramatically. 5 months had not turned her into another person. But the sharpness was gone from the way she carried herself. She sat beside her lawyer, rather than beside Dad. Dad was behind us with Peter. I did not turn around often. When the case was called, the formal process was brief compared with the months that led to it. The court heard that Mom was a first-time offender. Her attorney emphasized her age, lack of criminal history, and the panic of the emergency. The prosecutor emphasized the seriousness of the risk, her role as the supervising caregiver, the missing foreign body information, and the airway injury that required emergency removal. The victim impact material stayed focused on Zoe. I did not use the courtroom to tell the story of my childhood or punish Mom for every family argument. An 11-year-old had believed she was helping someone she loved. Adults had allowed that help to become responsibility. And after the emergency, she spent weeks checking clocks and asking who was remembering medication for a grown man. The sentence was 18 months in the House of Correction, 9 months committed, 9 months suspended, followed by 2 years of probation. The conditions included no unsupervised contact with Zoe and no caregiving responsibility for minors unless appropriately permitted. Nothing about it was presented as a mandatory result for everyone in Mom's position. It was the sentence for her conduct. Mom did not collapse or make a scene when the judge finished. She lowered her eyes. For a woman who had spent her life believing every problem could be managed, if she knew the schedule early enough, December 4th was now a date she could not optimize away. The life she had fought so hard to keep looking unchanged could no longer be made to look unchanged. The Paris trip had disappeared months earlier. The business class seats were gone. Some of the money had been recovered or converted where fair rules allowed. Some of the prepaid costs had not. None of it mattered anymore. Mom had once been furious at the idea of losing a trip because it represented freedom. Now her freedom had an actual legal boundary around it. That was the price she had never imagined paying. Outside the courtroom, Dad stood near a stone wall with Peter. He looked at Mom as she spoke with her lawyer. She did not look back. I wondered whether either of them remembered the ER clock. Probably. I did. Mom's social world changed, without any campaign from me. I told almost no one beyond the people who needed to know. Trips stopped, friends asked questions. Some stayed close and others became uncomfortable enough to drift away. The woman who had once organized group travel and told everyone exactly which train to take no longer occupied the automatic position of competence in every room. More important than any embarrassment was the loss of her old gatekeeper role. Peter and I spoke directly with Dad. Appointments happened without passing through Mom's interpretation. Care existed around him, without requiring her to define every problem first. That consequence reached the thing she had protected most fiercely: control over what the family was allowed to call reality. We were preparing to leave when her attorney walked away, and Mom finally approached me. There was a corrections officer nearby, but the moment did not feel dramatic. She looked at Michael first, then at me. She asked only one thing. She wanted me to make sure Zoe knew Grandma loved her. The request pulled at every part of me that still remembered the woman who made cupcakes for school birthdays and kept an emergency sewing kit in her car. I did not punish her with uncertainty. Zoe knows you love her. Mom closed her eyes briefly. That was not absolution, it was truth. Love had never been what the investigation needed to determine. Love was not what the court had measured. Love was not what Mom had lost. Trust was. I did not say the rest. I did not need to. Mom nodded. Then she turned back toward the people responsible for the next part of the process. By that evening, she had begun serving the committed portion of her sentence. The house where my parents had lived for more than 30 years contained Dad alone for the first time. Peter stayed with him that first night, because decades of routine had disappeared in one day, not because Dad was incapable of existing without Mom. I went home to Zoe. She knew there had been a court hearing. We had told her the broad truth without making her responsible for the punishment. Grandma had admitted she had made a dangerous choice when Zoe was hurt. A judge had decided there would be consequences. Zoe did not ask how many months. She asked whether Grandpa was alone. I told her Uncle Peter was with him. Her shoulders relaxed. That small response told me the old reflex was still there, who was taking care of Grandpa, but it no longer became an instruction for her to do it. That was progress. Several days after sentencing, Dad called. He sounded different in a house without Mom. The silences around his sentences were not being filled by someone else. He told me he understood the rules. He would not ask to see Zoe alone. He would not ask her to manage anything for him. He wanted to know whether, someday, seeing her at all might be possible. I did not answer immediately. There had been a time when my parents' disappointment could make me reverse a decision before I fully understood why I made it. That part of me was quieter now. I told Dad the decision about safety belonged to Michael and me. Zoe would never be responsible for deciding whether he deserved access to the family. But her comfort mattered. If we believed a visit could happen safely, she would have the right to say she was not ready. Dad accepted that. No argument. No appeal to age. No reminder that he was her grandfather. A week later, Michael and I talked about it after Zoe went to bed. Dad had followed the conditions we set. He was attending follow-up. Adults managed medication. He was not driving. He had not asked Zoe to reassure him. Seeing him under our supervision was different from handing responsibility back to him. We decided a short visit could eventually be safe. Then we asked Zoe how she felt. Not whether Grandpa deserved forgiveness. Not whether she wanted to make him happy. Only whether she would feel comfortable seeing him with us there. She sat on the edge of the couch, considering it. For an 11-year-old, she had become far too accustomed to adults waiting for answers from her. I made sure she knew there was no correct one. She could say no. She could change her mind later. She could say yes and leave early. Zoe picked at the seam of the cushion. Then she nodded. She wanted to see Grandpa, but there was one condition she chose for herself. Mom stays in the room. By the end of September 2027, the thing I noticed most was how little our lives resembled a resolution. There was no clean line separating before from after. Mom had completed the committed portion of her sentence and was on probation. Dad still had mild cognitive impairment. Zoe still startled sometimes when someone coughed too hard in a restaurant, and Michael still forgot his keys often enough to prove that ordinary forgetfulness had not vanished from our lives. What had changed was where responsibility lived. Dad's medication and appointments were supported by adults, and he had chosen to include Peter and me where he wanted help without surrendering every decision or every piece of privacy. He still argued, joked, and made choices. He had simply stopped treating support as proof that his life was over. Zoe had seen him several times since the first supervised visit after Mom's sentencing. Always with Michael or me present. Never as a test. Never as a reward for good behavior. The first few visits had been awkward. Dad tried too hard not to ask Zoe for anything. Zoe tried too hard to prove she was not worried. They talked about school with the exaggerated politeness of people avoiding a large object in the middle of the room. Over time, the effort softened. That Sunday, in late September, was the first visit that felt almost ordinary. Almost. I drove Zoe to Dad's house just after lunch. The maples on his street had started turning at the edges, red appearing first on the leaves that received the most sun. The house looked smaller than I remembered from childhood. Maybe houses did that when you stopped entering them as a daughter and started entering as a parent measuring safety. What changed most in those supervised visits was not Dad's memory. He still repeated himself sometimes. He still had moments when a name or plan took longer to reach. The change was what happened around the lapse. Nobody rushed to cover it before he noticed. Zoe did not automatically answer for him, and I did not step in simply because silence made me uncomfortable. Dad used the calendar beside his chair, checked a note, or asked for help from an adult when he needed it. Some moments remained awkward. Others passed without ceremony. That was the version of dignity I wished we had understood earlier, not pretending help was unnecessary, but allowing him to receive it without making a child responsible for preserving his pride. Each visit made that distinction a little more ordinary, which was exactly what Zoe needed. Her relationship with Grandpa could become about what they shared again, instead of what she prevented other people from seeing. Dad opened the door before we knocked. He had lost a little weight. Not enough to frighten me, but enough that his old flannel shirt hung more loosely at the shoulders. There was a weekly schedule attached to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a lobster. Medication times. Appointments. Numbers for the adults involved in helping him. A plastic pill organizer sat on the kitchen counter inside a larger labeled container. It was not Zoe's job to know what was inside. That fact had become so normal that I almost missed how enormous it would have seemed a year earlier. Dad noticed me glance toward it. He did not explain. He did not need to. A support person had already helped him organize the week that morning. Peter would check in the next day. Dad knew what time his next dose was supposed to happen, but if he forgot, the system did not collapse. There were adults behind it. Zoe walked into the living room and looked toward the bookcase. The old street map puzzle Dad used to keep there was gone. In its place sat a model bridge they had started years earlier and never finished. Dad saw her looking at it. He said the missing span was still her fault because she had abandoned engineering for middle school. Zoe rolled her eyes. That was a good beginning. They sat across from each other with me nearby. I had learned not to perform supervision visibly. Hovering changed people. So I opened a magazine and let them talk. Dad asked about school. Zoe told him 7th grade was proof adults had invented lockers before children were tall enough to reach the top shelf. He asked whether she still liked science. She said mostly. Then he asked how her band concert had gone. Zoe corrected him gently. The concert had not happened yet. It was next month. Dad nodded. A few minutes later, after talking about something else, he asked how the band concert went. I saw Zoe react before she spoke. Her shoulders shifted. Her eyes moved automatically toward me, then back to him. For more than a year, a repeated question from Grandpa would have pulled Zoe into the old routine. Answer quickly. Keep him from noticing. Check the clock. Remember what came next. I saw the reflex return when Dad asked about the concert a second time, and she glanced toward the clock as his medication time approached. She started to remind him. Dad noticed before she could finish, checked the clock himself, and turned back to her. The adult system around his medication did not depend on Zoe, and this time he acted like he knew it. You don't have to remember for me. The room became very still. I lowered the magazine. Zoe stared at him. Dad did not smile as though he had said something wise. That made the moment stronger. He simply waited. The old Gordon would have enjoyed the help, maybe without even noticing the cost. The newer version noticed. Zoe looked toward the kitchen again, then back at him. Her shoulders dropped. Only a little, but I saw it. She told him her concert was next month. Dad nodded. This time he wrote it on the calendar beside his chair on his own, using the support he had learned to build around himself instead of around her. Then he asked what piece she was playing. The conversation moved. That mattered most. They moved on to music. Zoe complained about a clarinet player who squeaked loudly enough to frighten the percussion section, and Dad revived his theory that schools owned too many clarinets. She laughed. Nothing in the exchange required an apology speech. He had forgotten something. She had not been recruited to hide it, and the conversation simply continued. Halfway through the visit, Dad got up to make tea and checked the cupboard twice before finding the mugs. He returned with 3 even though Zoe had asked for water, looked at the extra mug and said, "Apparently I'm expecting company." Zoe started to help, then stopped. Dad put the mug aside himself. No one pretended the mistake had not happened, and no one needed Zoe to fix it. The moment passed without becoming a lesson. Later, Zoe told him about a school project involving local architecture. That opened an old door between them. Dad spent 20 minutes explaining why a bridge near Boston was more interesting than people realized. Zoe interrupted twice to say she was not putting 20 minutes of bridge history into a 5-minute presentation. Dad ignored the first warning. He accepted the second. By the time we left, the unfinished model bridge had moved from the bookcase to the dining table. Zoe said they might finish it someday, with no deadline and no need attached to it. She left the model on the table when we went home. Outside, she climbed into the car and fastened her seatbelt. I waited for her to say something about Grandpa's medication. She did not. Halfway home, she asked if we could stop for ice cream. That request felt like a victory too small to explain to anyone who had not lived through the previous year. I said yes. A week later, Peter called because Dad had been unusually tired after an appointment. We compared what we had noticed, and Peter said he would ask Dad directly whether he wanted it raised at follow-up. The call lasted 5 minutes. No message traveled through Mom, and no one competed to be the child who understood Dad best. That quiet directness would have seemed almost radical in our old family. Peter and I had spent years learning about each other through Mom's summaries. He was angry. I was worried. Dad supposedly meant one thing, and Peter supposedly meant another. Now, we disagreed sometimes about Dad's care, talked to him directly, and survived the disagreement. Michael and I changed in a similar way. He still did not want one terrible year to turn him into someone who treated every disagreement in my family as danger. But not my family was no longer a reason to silence his judgment. If something involving Zoe concerned him, he would tell me. If I dismissed it merely because the person involved was my parent, he would tell me again. I promised him the same. Respect no longer meant pretending not to see something because seeing it might make another adult uncomfortable. That was not a dramatic marriage vow. It was simply a rule we intended to keep, the next time keeping it was inconvenient. Mom remained the relationship that routine could not repair. She was out of custody and on probation, and her marriage to Dad had not returned to its old arrangement. I did not know every private detail between them, and by then I had stopped believing I needed to. Peter had more contact with her than I did. Some parts of her life were allowed to exist outside me. Mom's first request to see Zoe after release came through the appropriate channel. She did not appear at our house, or send a relative to pressure us. Michael and I considered the probation conditions, Zoe's progress and Mom's behavior, and decided we did not have enough reason to reopen contact yet. Only after making the safety decision ourselves did we tell Zoe that Grandma had asked. She wanted to know whether saying no would make Grandma sad. I told her it probably would. Her face tightened in the old way, the reflex that someone else's feeling might become her job to manage. I reminded her that Grandma was an adult with people responsible for her care and choices. Zoe thought for a while and said she was not ready. I told her okay. There was no ceremony and no demand that she justify it. Mom was hurt by the answer. Of course she was. Serving the committed portion of her sentence had satisfied the court. It had not restored trust on a schedule. She had to live with the difference. Later that same September, our own small family began talking about taking a short trip during the next school break. Nothing like Paris. Nothing designed to prove anything. Just a few days away during a school break, Michael wanted somewhere with decent hiking. Zoe wanted a hotel with a pool. I wanted somewhere that did not require me to coordinate 7 forms of transportation and pretend that counted as relaxation. The night before the trip, Zoe packed at the dining table. This time, her bag contained only her own things. A book, headphones, sweatshirt, charger, and far too many snacks. There was no medication pouch belonging to Grandpa. No room number she needed to hold for someone else. No hidden assignment inside the vacation. Michael asked whether she had packed her toothbrush. She froze, checked the bag, and looked at me when she realized she had forgotten it. For half a second, I saw the old calculation, the expectation that forgetting something meant someone else might pay for it. I shrugged and told her we would buy one. Zoe waited for a consequence that did not come. That seemed suspiciously easy. Michael told her civilization had made extraordinary advances in emergency toothbrush replacement. She threw a sock at him, missed, and reopened her bag only to add another snack. I laughed because nothing about the trip depended on her keeping another adult organized. The next morning, while we carried our bags toward the car, Zoe ran back inside for the book she had left on the couch. Nobody panicked. 30 seconds later, she climbed into the back seat and put on her headphones. In the rearview mirror, she looked almost 13, older than the girl who had once been proud to call herself Grandpa's co-pilot, but no longer watching the adults around her. For the next thing she needed to remember, I could not give Zoe back the summer before the battery or erase what had happened to our family. What I could do was protect the ordinary freedom in front of her now. Forgetting a toothbrush without failing anyone, visiting Grandpa without becoming his memory, loving people without carrying the jobs they were supposed to carry themselves. I started the car. Zoe was already looking out the window, completely uninterested in the significance I had attached to the moment. That felt right. Children should not have to carry the meaning of every family lesson. Sometimes they should just get in the car. She was 12 years old. For the first time in more than a year, that was all anyone needed her to be.